All right. Just for ASHA members, this is specifically about webcasts. Anybody that's watching remotely, CEUs are not available through Penn State or Patent. As an attendee of the webcast, you may print a copy of your attendance certificate and submit the certificate to ASHA certification directly for contact maintenance hours. If you are in an in-person audience, please submit the bubble sheet per the conference directions prior to leaving the conference. So that's just specifically for ASHA members. Okay, so let's get started. I'm going to introduce our speaker. I'm very excited to introduce him, Dr. Vincent Carbone. He is by far my favorite, and I look forward to every year getting to introduce him. I don't say that to everybody. So Dr. Vincent Carbone is a board-certified behavior analyst, doctorate, and New York State licensed behavior analyst. He received his graduate training in applied behavior analysis, ABA, at Drake University, Des Moines, Iowa, under the supervision of W. Scott Wood. He currently serves as an adjunct faculty member at Penn State University and teaches in the graduate programs in behavior analysis at the European Institute for the Study of Human Behavior in Parma, Italy, and at the medical school at the University of Salerno, Italy. His behavior analytic research has been published in several peer-reviewed journals, including the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis, the Analysis of Verbal Behavior, Behavior Modification, Research in Autism Spectrum Disorders, and others. He has provided the requisite university training and supervision in hundreds of board-certified behavior analysts in the U.S. and overseas. He is the 2017 recipient of the Jack Michael Outstanding Contributions in Verbal Behavior Award from Associations for Behavior Analysis, International's Verbal Behavior Special Interest Group. Currently, he serves as the director of the Carbone clinics in New York, Boston, London, UK, and Dubai. All clinics provide behavior analytic consultation, training, and therapeutic services to children with autism and developmental disabilities. Today, he will be presenting Teaching Advanced Verbal Behavior, and it's without ado, I welcome Dr. Vince Carbone.
Thank you very much, Heather. And you're one of my favorite introducers as well. So thank you very much. It's always good to see you and work with Patton. Today we're going to talk about teaching advanced verbal behavior. I had two objectives in mind. Well, I have several objectives in mind, but two areas that I was going to speak about. One was advanced manding, and basically manding for information. And of course the intraverbal. I will speak on the intraverbal. I noticed that Mike Miklos will be giving a talk on advanced manding, and I wrote it down, or Heather wrote it down for me. That's on Thursday, 9 to noon, session 82B. So I think you'll have a full session on just that topic, and I would suggest that you attend Mike's presentation on that. It will be excellent, and I suggest you do that. In the interest of time, then I will speak mainly on the intraverbal, because there's so much material and so much information involved in that. I'd keep it to that. I think it will be good. So your handout includes this information, so if you're interested in it, then certainly feel free to make use of it. I've got some data sheets related to manding and so on in here. However, I am going to speak mainly on teaching intraverbal behavior. What I'm going to try to do, first of all, is to review the current literature on the intraverbal and go through what other people are saying about it. I've not personally published on this topic, but I've made use of this literature. As a clinician and practitioner, I've tried to put together a protocol for teaching the intraverbal, and that's what I'm going to kind of suggest to you today. So my review of the literature is to present this information to you, but mainly in our clinics. How do we go about teaching the intraverbal, and what is the literature? How does the literature inform us about how to do that? And that's the purpose of the talk, to review the literature, see how it's informed us on a clinical, applied protocol on this particular topic, and then I'll present video illustrations of clinical applications. So that's my objectives for today, for the 3 hours that we have. If you have questions, certainly feel free to raise your hand. I'll be glad to respond if the questions become too much and break the flow, I'll ask you to hold your questions to a certain period. But if you have questions, I'll be glad to try to respond to that. Let me ask you a couple of questions about you. How many of you are board-certified behavior analysts? Yeah, good number. Good. How many of you are educators? Good. How many of you are parents of children with autism-related disabilities? Yeah, sure. Okay. How about school administrators? How many teach self-contained classrooms with children with autism? Okay, very good. And how about speech-language pathologists? Good number as well. Okay, good. I'm sure there's other groups I've left out, but that was intentional. No, it wasn't. But I got an idea of who you are. How many people teach intraverbal behavior on a regular basis to children with autism who don't acquire it typically? Yeah, okay. Most of you are involved in that, or at least guiding the practice related to that. I first just put up for you the behavioral classification, or Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior, and looked at the primary verbal operants. And of course, today we're going to be talking about the intraverbal response, which isn't just answering WH questions, but you'll see more of that as we move through it. So I'm going to speak mainly on the intraverbal and how to go about teaching it. Let's start off with Skinner's definition of the intraverbal. He defined the intraverbal, and I'll read some of this to you, as a verbal response controlled by a verbal stimulus, and the response product does not have point-to-point correspondence with the verbal stimulus, and the product of the verbal stimulus. Interestingly enough, there are only 7 pages in his book, Verbal Behavior, specifically on the intraverbal, in the section on control by verbal stimuli. Only about seven pages or so on the intraverbal, which is kind of surprising. It's an area that you would think he might have devoted more time to, but he came up with his definition. Now, he talks about the intraverbal other places, but only 7 pages. For example, there's at least 65 pages in the TACT chapter. The TACT chapter is about 65 pages. The intraverbal, only about 7 pages or so in his entire 480 or so page book, interestingly enough. Skinner went on to discuss the function and the form. Let me read to you what he said here. The intraverbal relations in any adult repertoire are the result of hundreds of thousands of reinforcements under a variety of inconsistent and often conflicting contingencies. Many different responses are brought under the control of a given stimulus word, and many different stimulus words are placed in control of a single response. Basically, the intraverbal is your intellectual repertoire. It allows you to contact and allows you to provide complex information, share it with others through reading, writing, presentation, and conversation. You can imagine what your social life would be and your social interactions would be if you didn't engage in intraverbal behavior. Somebody says something to you and you basically have nothing to say. And if you think about schooling, a large portion of our assessment of children during school-age children and all throughout schooling is all intraverbal behavior. All your responses on tests are intraverbal responses. There's not a lot of tacting that you do in response to exam questions, for example. Most of what you do is responding to verbal stimuli. The instructor writes something, asks you a question, and you have to respond to it. So your intraverbal repertoire is a very important one. People pretty much judge you by your intraverbal repertoire. When you're socializing with people, let's say you go to a party, how many of you are terribly interested in the tact repertoire of the people in the room? How many people think, boy, I wonder if they could tact everything in this room? Wouldn't that be interesting to talk to somebody who could tact everything? Wouldn't that be great? I wonder how their echoic repertoire is. Or I wonder if their listener, I wonder if they could touch the cup if I asked them to. I mean, you could care less about any of those sort of repertoires. What do you care about? You care about their intraverbal repertoires, their conversational repertoire. When you say something, do they say something? And people will judge you on your ability to respond to varying stimuli that are presented verbally to you in the form of conversation. So it's a very important repertoire. Failure to develop it limits your social life. And the back and forth interactions that occur throughout life are not likely to occur. Many persons with autism don't acquire the intraverbal repertoire, unfortunately. They develop an extensive man tact and maybe listener repertoire, mainly tact repertoire, because the tact repertoire is taught so much and is ever present in the environment, nonverbal stimuli are ever present. The MAN repertoire, if you teach it, certainly can be acquired by persons with autism and developmental disabilities. Listener repertoire as well. But as Sundberg and Sundberg pointed out, the intraverbal repertoire is not typically acquired. These other primary verbal operants, while they're prerequisites for the intraverbal, don't necessarily contribute to a conversation, except that they act as prerequisites for that repertoire. So it's a very important repertoire. 7 pages in the book Verbal Behavior on that topic, 65 or so, 66 pages on the tact. So it looks like the intraverbal is in need of some refinements and greater discussion as the field of the analysis of verbal behavior begins to develop and the research literature begins to develop. It seems like it's an area ready to be looked at and examined pretty carefully. So that's what I'm going to try to do with you is look at how people have examined that repertoire and what they've suggested, and then put together what I think is a clinical protocol for teaching that to children who don't acquire it typically. Intraverbal responses include things like, what's your name? You say Vince. What's your favorite food? Pizza, where you live. New York. Something you cut with is a knife. What did you eat for breakfast? And you say pancakes. But it's not just answering questions. It's things like, I sure am hungry. Well, I guess it's time to eat. I guess it's time to eat is an intraverbal. So don't think of intraverbal as just answering WH questions. It's responding to what other people say in everyday life. The party was great. Sure, it was really nice to see everyone. Most people like the food here. I don't understand why. Those would all be examples of intraverbal responses to what other people say. It's clear that the tact repertoire plays an enormous role in the development of the intraverbal. In fact, it's a prerequisite, and we'll talk about the prerequisites for a clinical protocol and application in a few minutes. But what I want to do is show you some examples of the typical development of the tact repertoire and of the intraverbal repertoire, typically developing children. I use my grandson as an example of that. As you know, as an overly solicitous grandfather, I take all kinds of pictures and videos of him, but I've made use of them for purposes of displaying typical development. So let me show you some examples of that. Let me start with the tact, because the tact plays a major role in ultimately developing the intraverbal. Let's take a look at how typical children acquire the tact repertoire. And you'll see why the intraverbal develops so quickly. I'll let you watch this. He's about 2.5 years old here, okay? His name is Kelvin. He's about 2.5 years old. Watch what happens here. He's going to take this over to his mother's card. It's a Valentine's Day card, and his mother, he's going to ask his mother to read it, as you'll see. And then watch how the tact repertoire is taught incidentally, accidentally, unwittingly, to a large degree.
Read this.
So there's a man. It's his mother, who's a speech-language pathologist, and it's claimed that he learned to speak so early because she's a speech-language pathologist. I suggest it's because I'm a behavior analyst. But that's a personal sort of thing, and it certainly makes for interesting Thanksgiving dinners. But in any case, this is Samantha, his mother, going to read to him.
To his grandson. These Valentine animals came straight from the zoo.
What is that?
What is it?
It's a tiger.
No, that one's a giraffe.
Giraffe.
Says,
Let's watch that again. The teaching of a tact. This is how tacts are acquired by typical children. And you can see why they're acquired so quickly. A large tact repertoire is required for the intraverbal, usually 200 to 300 tacts as a prerequisite, about a 2.5-year-old repertoire. Between 2 and 3 years old, the tact repertoire just explodes. Let's watch why that's the case. Watch.
animals came straight from the zoo.
What is that?
What is it?
It's a tiger.
Okay, here comes the verbal prompt from Mom as to what that is.
No, that one's a giraffe.
She says, that's a giraffe. He's looking at the giraffe, pointing to it. She says, giraffe. Watch what he does next.
Giraffe.
There's the echoic response to that. Now watch the reinforcer.
Says,
How many things could you teach to your children that you work with autism, if acted as a reinforcer? You see why it's acquired so quickly. People are talking all the time, looking at things, pointing to things. Children, typically developing children, are echoing either overtly or covertly. There may be some automatic reinforcement involved, but acts as a reinforcer. How many tacts could you learn in a day under that condition? You echo what is said, you tend to pay attention to what other people are looking at, joint attention, and in addition, somebody goes, and that response is now strengthened. Tomorrow, you could say, what is that? And he would say giraffe after one trial. Sometimes you don't even have to hear the response. It could be a covert response very easily. Pretty interesting to see how quickly. Now watch another example
These
of it.
Valentine animals came straight from the zoo to bring this wish a special...
Too much manding for information. She would like to go on, but she'll teach another tact accidentally.
For you.
What is that?
Who is it? That is zebra?
People, yeah.
And that's it. 2 tacts just acquired right there. You can imagine how many tacts would be acquired. A prerequisite for a strong intraverbal repertoire is the acquisition of tacts, and that can take years to acquire in many children with autism, and probably acts as a prerequisite for ultimately teaching the intraverbal, and that's why the intraverbal sometimes is taught too early, mainly because the tact repertoire hasn't been acquired very easily. Between 2 and 3, the tact repertoire just kind of explodes and develops, and you can see so easily why that's the case. Now let's take a look at Kellen learning intraverbal behavior. Now these are kind of rote intraverbals, but nevertheless important early on. Here he is pretty young. Early intraverbal behavior.
You waiting for eggs?
Notice he echoes immediately, echoes everything. You tend to echo things. Well, you're going to be brought under the control of the stimuli related to that. Watch what happens here. He's waiting for eggs.
Who's making the eggs? Who's cooking the eggs?
Who's cooking the eggs? Who's making the eggs? And now my wife is in the kitchen doing that, and what I do is I just point to her, for which he already has the tact, grandma. So it's a tact to intraverbal transfer. These occur all day long in typically developing children's lives. Watch.
Grandma, yeah.
He's more interested in the eggs than he is grandma, but nevertheless, he does respond. Well, you can see there's a tact to intraverbal transfer. Those occur all day long. All of these early sort of rote sort of intraverbals, which I think are critical for ultimately the development of multiply controlled intraverbals that are generative in the sense that you emit intraverbals that have never been taught and are not just rote responses, which of course is where we're going to go to in the literature, and we'll talk about some ways to move in that sort of direction. But you can see how easily the intraverbal is learned, rote as it may be early on, in many young children. Now take a look at the intraverbal at about 2.5 years old. Let's take a look at his intraverbal repertoire at about 2.5. Okay, so let me bring this up. Okay. Move this to the side. This was one of his favorite books, Good Night, Construction Site. Anybody read that to their children? Yeah, a lot of people. It's a great book. It's all these basically trucks and other sort of construction site equipment that you ultimately just kind of put to bed every night after a hard day of working, and then of course it's time for you to go to bed and go to sleep, and it just goes right into that. So take a look here. This is one of the pages. I'm reading this to him. You're just going to hear the audio. You're not going to see anything. It's my iPhone is pointed up looking at the track lighting is what you actually see. I just laid it next to the pillow.
He takes a bath, gets shining bright, pulls up his chute, turns off his light. He cuts his engine, slows his drum.
He's mad.
Looks a little mad there, doesn't he?
He says he looks mad. There's a tact. Kind of looks mad. Most intraverbals in young children like this are evoked by nonverbal stimuli, by tact stimuli. That's why people put an art history book on a coffee table between two people who may not know each other. It's a tact stimulus full of pictures and some text, but certainly full of pictures and drawings and artwork that you then can talk about as a way of evoking the intraverbal repertoire. So the intraverbal repertoire early on is evoked by nonverbal stimuli, and the tacts play an important role. So he tacts there a little bit. Watch where it goes next.
Yeah.
He looks mad.
Yeah.
What's he doing in this picture?
I don't know.
Look at the water. What's he doing?
He's taking a bath.
Taking a bath. There's a response, multiply controlled intraverbal, right? What's he doing here? Taking a bath. The nonverbal stimulus and the verbal stimulus now evoke it. Okay?
I think he's taking a bath.
Yeah, like me.
Like you.
Like me. Basically, now much more of an intraverbal sort of response without any nonverbal stimulus. Like me.
Take a bath.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like a mixer truck.
Like a mixer truck. See how the nonverbal stimulus now has acted as a kind of a conversation piece for intraverbal responses, only because he has a very large tact repertoire. Why? Because acted as a reinforcer. That's why it's so large.
It's the mixer truck.
But
Yeah.
he's sleeping with the blanket.
He's sleeping with the blanket. Now there's another tact.
He's sleeping with the blanket.
He's actually silly.
Isn't that silly? The sleeper,
There's intraverbal behavior now, much more of an intraverbal, multiply controlled.
the cement truck sleeping with a blanket.
That's not goody.
Not goody. I'm not sure where he's going with that.
Slows his drum. And dream sweet dreams of twirly fun. Shh. Good night, cement mixer. Good night.
Next.
Okay, now we turn the page.
Oh, who's this?
I don't know. Gotcha.
That's the dump truck.
Tact.
All those dirt.
Look at all that dirt. What do you think this is? Bouncing on the back of the truck.
I don't know. I get meatball.
It looks like a meatball?
Yeah.
Yeah, it could be.
He thinks that's a meatball coming out of the back of the truck. As I recollected, we had spaghetti and meatballs that night for dinner. Now it's bedtime, so he's thinking about meatballs here. It looks like a meatball. May have something to do with his Italian heritage as well. It probably played somewhat of a role.
I think it's a rock.
I get dirt too.
Yeah, it may be. And what's
I think it's a rock. I think it's dirt too.
this here? A pile of dirt and
Rocks.
rocks. He moves the dirt from place to place, then dumps it with a happy face. One final load spills on the heap. Now dump truck's tired and wants to sleep.
That's great.
Next page.
What do you do?
What's he doing?
I don't know.
What does he look like he's doing?
I don't know.
Look at the Z's. Z's. He must be what?
Tired.
He must be tired. And he's making a noise. What's that noise?
He must be tired. There's an example of a multiply control. Get the idea how the intraverbals are now evoked. That's why in preschool classrooms they do show and tell, okay? They don't do just tell. If you did just tell, you bring a child up in front of the room and say, it's now tell time. And you say, tell me about your favorite toy. And you'd get, that's an intraverbal response. The talking about your favorite toy would be an intraverbal response. You wouldn't get much of anything. So you bring your favorite toy, a nonverbal stimulus, and now you can talk about it, which then evokes intraverbals, multiply controlled sort of responses, both tact and intraverbal response. You're responding not only to the verbal stimulus, the product of the other person's verbal behavior, the verbal stimulus, but you're also responding to the nonverbal. Young children benefit from multiply controlled sort of situations like this. So let's take a look at what he says here.
Oh, what's that?
Snoring.
He's
Snoring.
snoring. That's right. And what's that man saying in the window?
Pipe down.
Hey, pipe down.
The guy is saying, pipe down, stop the snoring.
Hey, pipe down.
Yeah.
He likes that part. He begins to echo it.
Wants him to stop what?
And stop the dump truck.
Stop the dump truck from doing what?
Stop the dump truck from doing what? Think about all the stimuli you have to respond to. Stop the dump truck from doing what? We'll talk about the increasing complexity of the antecedent stimulus.
Snoring.
Snoring, right.
It's snoring.
He lowers his bed, locks his gate.
Hey, pipe down.
Hey, pipe down, he said.
Hey, pipe down.
Likes that part.
His wheels.
Pipe down.
It's getting late.
Pipe down.
Comes his head.
Pipe down.
He shuts his
Pipe
door.
down.
Comes in.
Pipe
Would
down.
you pipe down a little bit?
I said, would you pipe down a little bit?
Please?
Yeah.
Okay. And as soon as the engine slows to snores, shh. Good night, dump truck.
Good night, Jim Check.
Good night.
Good night.
Yeah. So you kind of see how the intraverbal kind of occurs. You saw him develop the tact repertoire easily. Then you saw the kind of rote intraverbals, and then you see the multiply controlled intraverbals, which probably clearly had some nonverbal stimulus control, but also controlled by other stimuli as well, not only the verbal stimulus. There was probably some other things going on, which we'll talk about, that contributed to that. That's pretty complicated sort of stuff when you think about how complicated that repertoire is and how little is written on the topic and how much we really know or not know about the intraverbal. So let's take a look now at some of the literature that's beginning to explore this issue of how to teach this repertoire. There's been there was a 2016 issue of the analysis of verbal behavior that was dedicated to the intraverbal. I urge you to take a look at that particular issue. 2016, Mark Sundberg and a few other people, including Dave Palmer and others, made some important points, I think, in that, along with a number of other people, made some important points about the intraverbal and how it's acquired, and suggest ways it might be used, or techniques that might be used in order to teach it, and methods. Palmer has looked at refining the definition of the intraverbal. Remember, I read to you Skinner's definition: a verbal stimulus evokes a verbal response, and there's no point-to-point correspondence. In other words, they don't match. When I say baby and you say baby, there's point-to-point correspondence. The beginning, the middle, and the end all sound the same. I present the stimulus, the acoustic stimulus. You produce an acoustic stimulus that sounds the same with the beginning, middle, and end. However, I say, what did you have for breakfast? Pancakes doesn't sound anything like the verbal stimulus that's presented, and that's what makes it an intraverbal response and not an echoic response. Okay? So it's a pretty broad definition, and maybe we need to narrow it and think about it in other ways, is what Palmer has suggested. It may be too narrow. The definition may be too narrow of the intraverbal. He suggests that only some responses to to someone else's verbal behavior meets the definition. For example, what is your name? Say your name. How old are you? Give your age. In educated people, what is the square root of 144? Intraverbal response. Meets the definition of the intraverbal by Skinner. In other words, you've had a history of reinforcement for those responses. These are kind of like the rote sort of responses that we can acquire. In other words, you've had a history of reinforcement. When somebody says your name, you've given your name in the past. When somebody says your age, you've given your age, and of course that changes, but you're usually correct. What's the square root of 144? You say 12. You have a history of being reinforced for doing that. But if I ask you what is the square root of 139, most people in this audience would not immediately be able to respond to that, for example. But the response would be an intraverbal, but something else is probably controlling that beyond just me saying, what's the square root of 139? A whole bunch of other activities have to go on in order to produce that response. And that's what Palmer is kind of suggesting, that there's a broader, that there's a broader way of looking at this, an important way to look at it. What did you eat for breakfast yesterday, or what did you do on your vacation last summer, are these types of questions. Let's take a look at this. These answers to those type of questions, I ask you, what did you do on your vacation in 2000? Well, you might have to kind of stop for a minute. The response would be an intraverbal. Let's say it went to Aruba or something like that. Well, the response would be an intraverbal, but there'd be an awful lot of other things that would occur between when the stimulus was presented, what did you do on your vacation, and the response aruba. There's a whole bunch of other things that go on that are suggested that the intraverbal definition by Skinner does not include, but may need to be included. And the more you understand the need to include them, the more you'll understand how to teach the intraverbal to children who don't acquire it typically. And just as importantly, what the methods are to overcome some of that difficulty. Palmer suggested that these responses are the result of an added effect of a cascading of stimuli generated by the question. Now we're talking about mediation, we're talking about covert, overt mediation of the response. This may contribute to why it is so difficult for many children with autism to acquire this particular skill. For example, here's stimulus 1. Where did you go on your vacation last year? There's stimulus 1. Okay, response is Venice, as you can see. But when somebody asks you that question, and maybe if it was maybe not last year, but 10 years ago, a whole bunch of other responses start to occur, and probably covertly. You talk to yourself. You say things like, okay, my vacation last year or 10 years ago. All right, that's what I'm thinking about. My vacation last year or 10. You might say to yourself, now what was I doing then? Where were we? What month do I think it was? Now you might start asking yourself a bunch of questions that might help to generate. So in other words, now there's stimulus 2 that's now occurring, which is you basically talking to yourself, asking yourself questions, potentially covertly, because of course we can engage in verbal behavior covertly, privately, if you will. You might also even visualize. You might say, well, wait a second, let me think about that. Let's see, where did we go on our vacation? Let's see, we're here. And now you start to almost try to see where you were. And you can do that. And that can be explained behaviorally, and we're going to talk about that. Because there's been some research on trying to get this response to occur in typically developing children. So imagining and visualizing is a behavioral process, and hopefully I'll add something to your repertoire and information about that as we're going to talk about Skinner in a minute, and Skinner's analysis of that and what exactly that is, visualizing, seeing in the absence of the thing seen. Very nice title, seeing in the absence of the thing seen. So you might try to visualize it, and you might start to see some canals, okay? And then you might also start to hear some music, potentially, as you start to ask questions. I say, well, okay, I think it was Italy. Okay, and now you might even hear a mandolin or two kind of playing. Now all of these stimuli, there's 4 or 5 different stimuli now that come to evoke the response Venice. So it's not just a verbal stimulus, where'd you go on your vacation last year, evokes a verbal response Venice with no point-to-point correspondence. There's probably something going on in between the presentation of the stimulus and the response, and it's probably some kind of private, covert form of mediation in the form of operant seeing in the absence of the thing seen, operant hearing in the absence of the thing heard, probably some sort of asking of questions of yourself. Also, you might be talking to yourself, and there may be some respondent behavior as well, what's referred to as conditioned seeing. The question may evoke a certain sort of Pavlovian, if you will, respondent, so that you might feel some kind of movements of glands and muscles, so to speak, and you may be, when asked that question, you may think about how much fun you had, which may also add to the response. So there may be some respondents, and there's certainly some other operants, okay, under the control of the basic principles. So visualizing and imaging or perceptual behavior, basically what you do when you see in the absence of the thing seen is you do what you did when the stimulus was present. We're going to talk about that in a minute, because I think it's an important part of understanding what goes into intraverbal behavior. I think it's an important part. Palmer talks about this fairly extensively in his paper on memory, but he kind of elaborates on it in his paper in 2016 related to the intraverbal. You hearing in the absence of the thing heard. You do what you did, considering seeing to be a form of behavior and hearing to be a form of behavior. You do what you did when the stimulus was present. But we'll all agree it's under weak stimulus control, isn't it? I mean, when you close your eyes and try to remember somebody, for example, you can kind of see them. You don't even have to close your eyes. You can just kind of draw up the image, so to speak. Well, what is that behaviorally? That may contribute to what's going on during intraverbal behavior. And it may be part of the reason why so many children with autism have difficulty talking to themselves. These covert mediating sort of stimuli do not occur. Skinner used to refer to these as precurrent behaviors. They're behaviors you engage in that makes another behavior more likely. He talked about that in the context of problem solving. You solve a problem, some response is scheduled for reinforcement, as Palmer talks about it, but you have no response in your repertoire. So you engage in a whole bunch of other behaviors. Skinner wrote a book with Maggie Vaughan titled Enjoy Old Age, in which he discusses a lot about precurrent behavior. As your repertoire begins to break down, you may have to do other things to make other responses that will garner reinforcement appropriate. I'll give you an example. I engaged in it last night. I had to remember to pick up one of the speakers. I'm saying at the Nittany Lion Inn, and one of the other speakers is there as well, and I had to remember at 8 o'clock to be outside with the car, because I have the car, outside with the car, and I thought, I'll forget. So what did I do? I took a big piece of paper, and I wrote his name on it, and put it in front of the door. I would literally have to trip over it. That's an example of a problem-solving behavior, precurrent behavior. I engaged in one behavior of putting the piece of paper there so that another behavior of remembering to pick up Tim Vollmer would in fact occur without missing that opportunity and not engaging in that response. It's an example. And in the book Enjoy Old Age, Skinner talked about a lot of that sort of stuff. Most of you don't need it, but at some point you will. And I highly recommend it. I got 3 of them on my 50th birthday from 3 different people. I thought it was nice, but I think they were trying to tell me something as well. But in any case, well, let's now talk about these mediating responses. Talking to yourself, pretty straightforward, responding to what other people say. But what about this seeing in the absence of the thing seen, hearing in the absence of the thing heard, which may contribute to the difficulty that many children with autism have in developing the intraverbal repertoire. So let's take a moment to kind of talk about what Skinner said about that, which then may suggest some methods for teaching it, which I'll show you some things we've tried and some things other people have tried to generate this problem-solving repertoire, which, remember, is between the verbal stimulus and the verbal response. Something else is going on in there. We'll do some examples of that. I'll give an opportunity for you to do a little thought experiment and see what I mean. But let's talk about what Skinner said first. The environment affects an organism after as well as before it responds. So the environment continues to affect you after as well as before the response. Now I'm going to read some of these because I think they deserve being read. These are quotes from Skinner. Most of them are from About Behaviorism, where he really outlined a chapter on perceptual behavior. I highly recommend it in About Behaviorism, a chapter on perceptual behavior where he kind of outlines these issues. He does it in Science and Human Behavior and some other places as well. But here, after hearing a piece of music several times, a person may hear it when it is not being played, though probably not as richly or clearly. You would agree with that. If you want to hear your favorite song, I bet you could hear it right now, given the right circumstances. If I would be quiet for a minute, you could probably hear your favorite song. What is that behaviorally? I mean, that sounds like this mentalistic, cognitive sort of process in which you're retrieving a copy someplace, but not the case. So far as we know, and Skinner goes on to explain it, he is simply doing in the absence of the music some of the things he did in the presence of it. In other words, if you think about hearing music and hearing as a form of behavior, topography of which is probably neurological, but that hearing is a form of behavior. Similarly, when a person sees a person or place in his imagination, he may simply be doing what he does in the presence of the person or place. You ever had the experience in which, well, let me read this next one, and then that comment will make more sense. A slight noise at night is heard as a burglar or mouse by those who respond vigorously to burglars or mice. Level of deprivation makes a difference. One mistakenly hears the telephone if a call is important. You've all experienced those sorts of things. Ever had the situation in someone that you've been very close to is no longer around, and you're walking, and suddenly from the back and maybe from the side, you swear that's the person. You'd really like to see the person. In other words, there's a strong MO, deprivation from that person, and suddenly you see them. But then they kind of turn a little bit more and say, oh, no, no. Respond vigorously to mice or burglars. Respond vigorously. You tend to see people who you like to see, to whom it would be reinforcing to see. You tend to engage in that behavior. Well, if that behavior is under the control of motivation, basic principle, then that response must be a what? Must be an operant. It must be a form of behavior if motivation makes you see things in the absence of those things seen. It must be an operant of some. And the stimulus control variable. We know stimulus control and motivation are two basic principles. The stimulus is not particularly clear. So there's weak stimulus control that makes you, so in other words, the stimulus control issues involved. If stimulus control and motivation are controlling responses, those must be operant behaviors, and in fact they are. So seeing in the absence of the thing seen is merely doing what you did when the stimulus was present under weak stimulus control. And when you try to think of somebody you would like to see, you can see them, but not very clearly. That's for sure. The stimulus isn't there, so to speak, but you do what you did when the stimulus was present. I suggest some of intraverbal behavior, and Palmer suggests that, and I think he's right. Some of intraverbal behavior is doing that, as we'll see in just a minute as I do a little experiment with you. The traditional formulation is a metaphor. We tend to act to produce stimuli which are reinforcing when seen. If we have found the city of Venice reinforcing, we say it's beautiful, we may go to Venice in order to be thus reinforced. You can always do it. You'd say, boy, I really enjoyed my vacation at this place. Couldn't you then start to remember it, visualize it? You can see all those. So what is that? That's a behavioral process. That's not a mental cognitive process in which a copy is retrieved. You're merely doing what you did when those stimuli were present under weak stimulus control. It's a form of behavior. All we need to say is that if we are reinforced for seeing Venice, we are likely to engage in that behavior. That is the behavior of seeing Venice. The behavior of seeing Venice. Even when there is very little in the immediate environment which bears a resemblance to the city. Just the name alone could be enough to evoke the response. Those are all mostly operant responses. Okay? We also see things in its absence, not because we're immediately reinforced. I mean, if you like dogs, what do? You see dogs everywhere. You think about dogs. You imagine things about dogs. You see them everywhere. And he says, but that's not the only reason why you engage in that behavior. But because we're then able to engage in other behavior which is subsequently reinforced. Thus, we may see Venice in order to tell a friend how to find his way to a particular part of the city. If we were together in the city itself, we might take him along a given route. But we can take ourselves along the route visually when we are not there and describe it to him. Operant seeing at the private level may be reinforced in other ways. The private response may produce discriminative stimuli which prove useful in executing other behavior, precurrent behavior. Being able to see things may lead to another response which is scheduled for reinforcement. Let's do a little example of this. What I want you to do is to count the number of count the number of windows in the front of your childhood home. Now, if you had many childhood homes, choose one, okay? Count the number of windows in the front of your childhood home. I bet most of you could do that. That be fair to say? You can see, you don't see it very clearly, but what you're doing when you do that is you're doing what you did when your childhood home was in front of you. So there's an intraverbal question. How many windows were in the front of your childhood home? There's what's scheduled for reinforcement is a number. We may never know what's correct or not, but a certain number is scheduled for reinforcement in an informed individual who could also do the same thing. And what do? You engage in some mediating responses. Were most of you able to count them? You could see your childhood home, and you could. I can do it very easily. I bet most of you can as well. That's the sort of behavior that we're talking about. That's not pulling up a copy. That's doing what you did when your childhood home was present. Okay? Let me give you another intraverbal exercise. Here's the question. With an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper in front of you, with the horizontal side going 11 inches, write the numeral 1 and 2 in the upper corners and 3 and 4 in the lower corners from left to right. Then flip the paper over from top and do the same on that side, the flipped over side. Now curl the corner with the numeral 3 on it, and what numeral do you see on the reverse side? If anybody has an answer for that immediately, it has diagnostic implications, okay? So I wouldn't admit to it, okay? But I bet most of you can do it. Let's do it. With an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper in front of you, but don't do it with it. Do it in the absence of the thing. Saying don't actually do it, but do it in your head, so to speak. Okay. Write the numerals 1 and 2 in the upper corners and 3 and 4 in the lower corners from left to right. Then flip the paper over from bottom to top and do the same on that side, writing the numerals 1, 2, 3, 4. Now curl the corner with the numeral 3 on it, and what numeral do you see on the reverse side? How many people know what? Go ahead and do it. Hold up the number of fingers that signify. Make sure you use the right finger, okay? Yeah, it's the numeral 1. Yeah, it's the numeral 1. How many people actually did it? Yeah, you actually, could you see it? Could you see? And you flipped it over, you could curl it up, and there it was. Now, what is that? That's a behavioral process. That's behaving in the absence of the stimuli. But you basically could do it. That's a repertoire of behavior. Get the idea of how important that is? How important that is to be able to do that. That was an intraverbal question, right? There was a question. But you notice there was a latency there where a whole bunch of other things had to happen before you could make that response. Palmer is suggesting, and I think Skinner suggested to some degree, and others are suggesting, and I found in clinical practice, that there is something else that goes on between the stimulus and the response, and it's a whole bunch of these things, and some of the things are these sorts of things. That was an intraverbal response. In particular, he does not store copies of the stimuli which have played a part in the contingencies. There are no iconic representations in his mind. There are no data structures stored in his memory. He has no cognitive map of the world in which he has lived. He has simply been changed in a way that stimuli now control particular kinds of perceptual behavior. Seeing does not require a thing seen, as you just kind of demonstrated to yourself. It suggested that some of what goes on in intraverbal behavior probably includes that, because you gave the intraverbal response 1, but it wasn't the verbal stimulus alone that evoked that response. There was a whole bunch of other things you did, and those were the mediating responses that led to the correct response, and that may be an important part of what's going on in intraverbal behavior. And some of this I've already said. Palmer suggests that we call these sort of responses that you just engaged in intraverbal control rather than just intraverbal. That we reserve the term intraverbal for how old are you? What's your name? In other words, things that have been reinforced. Or now, when I read that again to you, and I say, curl the corner, and what numeral do you see? And you just say 1 now, that would just be meeting Skinner's definition of an intraverbal. However, when you originally engaged in it, Palmer suggests it's intraverbal control because there are many other stimuli that mediate that response. And we're suggesting, and Palmer is suggesting, and I see it in my own clinical practice, that that is one of the reasons why intraverbal behavior is so difficult to acquire, because of these mediating responses that may not be part of the repertoire. And that's why you may teach and teach and teach and get only these rote intraverbals by Skinner's definition, and not get responses to questions that have never been asked or to statements that you've made that have never been presented to the child. You can respond to all kinds of stimuli that have never been presented to you, verbal stimuli that have never been presented to you. You can respond probably because of all this mediating behavior that occurs. So that's an important takeaway point. Private-public mediation is responsible for complex interverbal behavior. The mediation may be verbal, perceptual, covert, overt. This should be referred to as interverbal control versus the rote sort of memorized interverbals, if you will, or ones that you've responded to previously and now do. That's why, what's the square root of 144? Most people have had, educated people have come in contact with 12. And it no longer is, it's not under interverbal control. There's no mediating responses. You just simply respond to the stimulus without this cascading of private events that go on. I think that's an important component. I think you should think about that. And we'll look at some ways that this information can be helpful in ultimately teaching interverbal behavior. The typical progression of interverbal behavior looks something like this. Let's start to look at this now. Some of this is derived from some of Mark Sundberg's work, 2011, 2016. Let's take a look at it. 18 months to 2 years, animal sounds, sing songs, fill-ins, etc. 2 years old, begin to respond to simple questions. What's your name? Word association, shoes, and socks. 2 to 3 years old, that's where the rapid development of the verbal repertoire occurs, and changes in the interverbal start to occur as the tact repertoire, as you saw with Kellen, starts to develop. Can respond to questions such as, what do you want to eat? And also, let's go outside, I'll put my shoes on. Conversational exchange at about 3 years old start to occur, and the interverbal now is occurring in earnest. And by 4 years old, children can talk about past events, they can describe what they want to do, respond to novel questions, and so on in social context. So the interverbal repertoire goes through this developmental sort of process. This is Sundberg's VB map, 18 to 30 months, 30 to 48 months. He's kind of outlined just the milestones here. Okay? Well then, what may be the prerequisites for teaching interverbal behavior? What may be the prerequisites for teaching interverbal behavior? If that's the kind of development that we see. Teaching interverbal too soon can lead to rote and non-functional interverbal behavior, so we've got to be careful of that. Most children with developmental disabilities should have acquired about a 2.5-year-old level of primary and secondary verbal behavior. In other words, about a 2.5-year-old level, besides some of the fill-in sort of responses that occur. Before some of those fill-in sort of responses, shoes and socks, wash your hands, up and down, ready, steady, go, those sorts of things. About a 2.5-year-old level. So that's a pretty sophisticated level before you start teaching interverbal behavior in earnest. Teaching it before that may cause some difficulties in ultimately acquiring the response. So what does that look like, about a 2.5-year-old? Acquiring mands without specific training. They're beginning to learn mands without having been taught, without an echoic prompt under control of a strong MO, but now acquiring mands without specific training. A tact repertoire of at least 200 nouns and verbs, but probably more, and at least 300 or 400 words in the repertoire, mainly mands, tacts, and some interverbals, easy interverbals, simple ones. A listener repertoire of at least 250 selection responses, probably more. Usually by this age you have about twice as many listener responses, which is sometimes referred to as receptive language, about twice as many as you do spoken words, expressive language. Responds as a listener to what, who, which, and is tacting most of the items that are selected. This is the LRFFC sort of thing, LRFFC. What do you cut with, for example, or better, an example of touch the one that's silver, touch the one that's red. In other words, you're responding to the features and functions of things and not just by the name of the thing, but responding to them by the features and function. In other words, listener behavior by feature, function, and class. Give me the one that you drink from. Give me the one that you write with. And the tact is occurring at the same time when those stimuli are presented, which seems to be a very important issue for ultimately teaching the interverbal. And also engages in social play and peers and responds to other children's mands and initiates mands. Why would this be important? Well, the interverbal is controlled ultimately and is reinforced by generalized social attention. If generalized social attention doesn't act as a form of reinforcement, the intraverbal will not be acquired very easily. That's why the MAND usually occurs much earlier than the intraverbal, because of the strong motivation and the strong reinforcing value of getting what you want specific to your motivating operation, specific to your desire for something, some condition of deprivation potentially. Well, you get the idea. The intraverbal is not controlled by the MO precisely and most effectively. It's mainly under the control of social attention and social reinforcement, not only attention, but social reinforcement in general. And as a result, if there isn't much play that's going on that's under the control of social attention and the reactions of other people, then the intraverbal may be difficult to acquire in that situation. Okay? So these are some of the prerequisites. What I'm trying to do, once again, is I've tried to summarize the literature and take what I think are the important issues within the literature and give you kind of a protocol. I'm not sure I've got it all completely right, and I'm sure I'll rethink some things, and some new research will come out and we'll rethink some things, but try to give you kind of a protocol for how to think about this very important skill and some prerequisites. Teaching intraverbal behavior too early can be ineffective, and therefore be aware of the prerequisites for teaching intraverbal behavior. Let's take a look here at a paper by Sundberg in 2011. And this is a very interesting paper because it's a descriptive analysis comparing children with autism and typically developing children in the development of their intraverbal repertoire. It's a real nice paper on this topic. Take a look at, this is the paper here. There's an increase in intraverbal responses with age. As children get older, typically developing children get older, the intraverbal response, more intraverbals occur and they become more complex. Errors of young children generally included not responding or just saying something they had said before. So when asked to say something, they either don't respond, tell us about your favorite toy, not much to say. Older kids showed some discrimination, but without the control of all parts of the stimulus. This is an important point. For example, he gives us an example. What do you smell with? And the child says, poopies. Well, that's what you smell. That's not what you smell with. You get the idea that if you took any one of those two words alone, smell and with, they would not generate poopies. They have to come together in some way. In other words, there are multiple components of the stimulus have to come together to produce a response that no one stimulus in one component would produce. That's pretty complex sort of stuff. We'll talk more about that. We'll take a break in just a second. This is an intraverbal assessment, and I'll just pull it up for you. You can get this on Mark Sundberg's website. I think it's really good. He basically has 8 groups of intraverbal questions that you would basically, intraverbal stimuli, if you will, that you would present to children. Group 1, a kitty says. It's basically animal sounds and fill-ins. Group 2, fill-ins, associations. You brush your teeth, shoes and socks. You ride a bike. You flush the toilet. You sleep in you get the idea there. 3, and these are increasing complexity. Simple what questions? What do you drink? What can fly? What are some numbers? 4, simple who, where, and 8. Who is your teacher? Where do you wash your hands? Who builds a web? Where do you take a bath? Let's take a look now at 5, categories, functions, features. What shapes are wheels? What grows outside? So on. 6, adjectives, prepositions, adverbs. What color is my shirt? What do you eat with? 7, multiple part question. What makes you sad? Tell me something that is not a food. What helps a flower grow? When do we set the table? What do you do with money? Why do people wear glasses? You can easily see how somebody who isn't controlled by wear and glasses might very easily say, why do you wear glasses? And somebody might say shirt. Okay. Why do you wear glasses? Drink from. You can easily see how any one of those stimuli alone would not produce the same response that both components have to combine. This is sometimes referred to as compound stimuli or verbal conditional discriminations. Okay. We'll talk more about that. multiple part questions. What's in a balloon? And generally, this is about a 4-year-old level. This is about a 4-year-old level when you go through all 8 sections. This is downloadable from Sundberg's website, and I think it's a good one. They're going to take away the food at what time, Heather? 10:30. At 10:30? I don't want you to miss your food, so I know how important that is. Okay, we can go a few more minutes then, right? Okay, yeah, we'll just go. Okay, I don't want to deny you your food. Okay, that would be troubling. Okay. Let's take a look at the development of this intraverbal repertoire now. This is a chart that, when you look at it, doesn't invite you to spend a lot of time with it. Okay, you don't immediately say, "Boy, I'd like to spend some time figuring out what's going on here." But let me help you with it. Okay, on the y-axis up the left side of the chart, right over here, that's age in months. Okay, so this is about a 5-year-old up here. Okay, so that's age. Okay. Over here is the intraverbal scores from 0 to 80. Remember, there were 80 questions. You get 1 point for each question on that intraverbal assessment. Okay, so this is from 0 to 80. Best score possible is 80. Okay, this solid line here is about a 3-year-old level, right? 36 months, right? So you read it on the left axis. Okay. Over here is a line showing the increasing age in months, okay? Increasing age in months, and the solid data path is the scores on the test, okay? So what you can see here is that at about 3 years old here, look where children are scoring. At about 3 years old, look at where their scores are. Okay? And also take a look here at 5 years old. That's about where their scores are, somewhere around 60 or 70. And what you see is this increase in age, and you see this parallel increase in the intraverbal repertoire. Now, there's some variability. This was a group, I don't remember how many children. We contributed some of the children to these data from our clinic. But you can see the development of the intraverbal response with age. As age goes up, intraverbal scores go up as well. And you can see at 5 years old, typical children are scoring somewhere around 70, 60, 70, close to 75 or so. These are the intraverbal scores, okay? But now let's take a look at children with autism. Now, you've got to look at the difference in scale, okay? This is a 10-year-old right here. Now we're going up to 200 months. This is a 10-year-old right here, and the same scale here on 0 to 80. Look where we are here with a 10-year-old. You see the increasing age, but you see scores all over the place in kids with autism. And this here are 10-year-old children, who are now scoring somewhere between 50 and 60, maybe a little higher, somewhere around 60 or so. Whereas 5-year-olds were scoring 60 in the typically developing group. You can see how far behind most children with autism are on the intraverbal repertoire. Look where the 5-year-olds are scoring. 5-year-olds are scoring somewhere down here around 20 or so. And the 10-year-olds now are at least close to where the 5-year-olds are with typically developing children. So you see much greater variability with the age groups. You see no large jump in responding at around 3. Look here on the typically developing kids. Here. Here's 3, and look at the jump up. Now go to kids with autism. If you take a look, it's right down here, 3 years old, right down in this area here, and you don't necessarily see the same pattern. And much more rote or simple, echoic sort of responses. And what he gives you here in this paper is the assessment total scores between 20 and 29, 30 and 39. Remember, it goes to 80, his assessment with those questions. There's the intraverbal question. Look at typically developing children and children with autism. And what he basically found was that irrespective of the ages, when children fall in one of those ranges, one of those assessment total score ranges between 50 and 59, and maybe that's a 3-year-old child who is typically developing, but an 8-year-old child with autism might fall there, what you find is they make the same kind of mistakes. They make the same kind of errors. that the developmental trajectory has more to do with scores on this assessment than it does with chronology when compared to typically developing children. Take a look here. This is another chart from this paper, typical development of the intraverbal. I won't go through all of this. I highly recommend you take a look at this. It really gives a nice breakdown of, these are small numbers. You can see how small the N is, but you've got 2-year-olds, 2.5-year-olds, 3-year-olds, and you see what starts to happen. The important sort of thing here is that you move out of, at about 2.5 to 3 years old, you start to move out of these rote sort of responses, and now you are able to respond to these multiple compound stimuli and these verbal conditional discriminations. You're now able to respond to them. I'm going to show you children, after we take a break and come back, when I start to show you some videos of children making these kind of errors. For example, what do you smell with, and the answer being poopy. What grows on your head? Plants. What day is today? Rainy. What's under a house? Roof. You get the idea that not all of the words in the verbal stimulus are effectively coming together to produce a response separate from any one of them, but maybe only one of the words is producing that. These are referred to as verbal conditional discrimination problems. So the heart of overcoming some of this will be to look at the issue of, first of all, problem-solving issues. How do we take care of those problem-solving issues that are necessary? And then how do we take care of verbal conditional discrimination problems? That seems to be at the heart of teaching intraverbal behavior. Teaching somebody to come under the control of all the components, all the words, if you will, of the verbal stimulus, and also be able to engage in some sort of problem-solving response that ultimately leads to a response that's scheduled for reinforcement. I think those are the two big issues confronting the teaching of children with autism. So you can teach a lot of these rote ones, but how do you get the children to come under the control of all the stimuli in the verbal stimulus? It really becomes the question. And I think that's where most of the research is currently heading, to try to figure that out, problem solving and the issue of verbal conditional discriminations. But once you know what the problems are, and you stop assuming they're things like auditory processing disorders or some other sort of invented sort of explanations for children with autism, why they don't acquire it, then you've kind of got a chance to start to address what those issues are. Once you know behaviorally, you can explain the variables, the behavioral variables that control the response. Now it's a matter of figuring out how you arrange them to bring somebody who doesn't acquire language typically under the control of those variables. And that's been the purpose of the work on the intraverbal. And these are some more examples of that. For example, by 4 years old, there's very strong intraverbal verbal conditional discrimination, but errors still occur. What do you smell with? A skunk. What's above a house? An airplane and stuff that's on the roof. Get the idea? You're starting to overcome some of those difficulties, but they're still there. Here's a group and a list of published papers on teaching the intraverbal. I don't have 3 hours with you, so let me give you some of the things that I think are useful in reading. As I've kind of set the stage so far, I think there's a problem-solving issue with kids with autism, and I think there's verbal conditional discrimination. And I think that because the literature has informed that. I think those are the issues that seem to need to be addressed. Now it becomes, how do we go about overcoming it? What are the teaching procedures? Well, these are some of the papers on the role of teaching some of these things. This is a nice paper. This is the paper by Dave Palmer that I talked about earlier. Verbal Stimulus Control and the Intraverbal by Mark Sundberg, 2016, a nice paper. This is the 2011 paper where you saw all those charts that I just presented. That's where those charts are. This is an outstanding paper. Judah Axe is here doing a presentation on motivating operations, which of course will be great. But on conditional discrimination in the intraverbal, a review and recommend. I know it's 10 years old, but it's still current. There has not been a lot done on this topic, but this paper by Judah is just outstanding on this topic, and I think you ought to make use of it. This is a paper by Sven Eichseth and his group, Verbal Stimulus Control, again, implications for practice. We'll talk about what's there. This is a paper that's reviewed Skinner's verbal behavior, and there's a whole section on the intraverbal that you may want to take a look at. This is a really good paper, Empirical Investigations of the Intraverbal, 2005 to 2015. Notice most of these are published in the Analysis of Verbal Behavior. So if you have a subscription to that journal, if you belong to ABAI, you can get a subscription to that journal. Most of these papers were published after the Association for Behavior Analysis took over the journal. Prior to this, a few years ago, you could get them all free online. You would have to have a subscription to the journal now to get the online full-text versions of these, but it's worth having. Takeaway point number 3, intraverbal behavior develops through increasing complexity of antecedent stimulus control. In other words, all of the different words in a verbal stimulus, it goes from simple to much more complex, and all of those words together evoke the response, and no one of those words alone would be responsible for the control. But there's a compounding effect and a verbal conditional discrimination sort of effect. Here's an example of it. Eat, what do you eat? You say burger. What do you eat for breakfast? Eat is now modified by breakfast. And now you say cereal. What do you eat for breakfast that is hot? Now breakfast, or now eat, is modified by breakfast and hot. And all of those words must come together. You get the idea. What do you eat for breakfast? Burger. Well, maybe you do, but that's probably, what do you eat for breakfast that's hot? And you say fruit. Well, eat was in there. Breakfast may have been in there, but hot had no control. That's the idea of that complexity of the verbal conditional discriminations building and how that all has to come together. I think the two major problems focused on in the literature right now, and I see in my own practice as well, is the problem-solving repertoire and the failure to develop it, and the failure to develop verbal conditional discriminations. Some of that comes from teaching the intraverbal too early, but some of it just comes from it's hard to bring many kids who don't acquire language typically under the control of these complex stimuli. Conditional discriminations are hard to learn. Which one would you rather teach? Teaching a child when you say stand up, that they stand up, or in an array of 5 pictures, teaching a child to touch the picture of somebody standing up. The first one is a simple discrimination. Stand up and you basically teach it. Simple discrimination. Find the picture in an array of 5 pictures. Only one is a picture of a child standing up. That's a conditional discrimination. That's much more difficult. Okay? Choosing the right one is conditional on a verbal stimulus and a visual stimulus coming together to produce the response. Whereas stand up is just under the control of stand up. It's much more difficult to teach conditional discriminations, and children with autism and persons with developmental disabilities are known to have difficulty with conditional discriminations. Good place to break. What we'll do when we come back is go through a sequence of methods for teaching the intraverbal based upon what I just said, and then we'll look at videos of clinical application. Okay? See you at 10:30. What I want to do in the second half of this talk is to now talk about the clinical applications of the things we've talked about. We've set the stage for what the problem is related to covert mediation, as well as the issue of verbal conditional discriminations. Let's look at how to overcome some of these difficulties. I've listed out here about 6 steps that I think, based upon the literature, suggests a protocol and a sequence for teaching intraverbal behavior. This is my best shot at it, based upon the literature. I develop it mainly because in our clinical settings, we teach intraverbal behavior, so we have to be informed by the literature. And so I've tried to, for our clinics, develop a sequence and a process by which we teach intraverbal behavior. And this is how I kind of read that literature and suggest, and we'll go through each one of these. Teach early intraverbal discriminations through fill-in songs, nursery rhymes, and so on. Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great, all those kinds of things. We'll look at examples of that. Teach many tact to intraverbal responses. We'll talk about that in a minute. Emphasize the development of convergent and divergent stimulus control by forming stimulus and response classes. This is a way of beginning to get away from rote, scripted sort of responding. And I'll talk about a webbing procedure, a procedure to pull all of that together that I have not researched, but I've seen good clinical benefit to that. There really isn't a lot on this topic in publication, so I'll give you some things that have not gone through peer review, but I think are reasonable things to do. Teach verbal conditional discriminations to overcome rote responding and learn intraverbal behavior typically. How to teach these conditional discriminations and a whole host of procedures for doing that, so that children will ultimately learn in a more typical sort of way. Use various teaching methods to increase conditional discrimination responses and novel responding, and then finally teach problem solving to increase intraverbal behavior. So I've got these listed out here as 1 through 6, and what I'll do is now just step by step go through this sequence that I make use of, that I think I know is informed by the literature, and it's my impression this is the way to kind of proceed. There really is nothing in the literature that, if you notice the literature, it's all kind of scattered. There's a study on this, a study on this, a study on this, study on this, but nothing that's kind of pulled it together. And what I'm trying to do is kind of prop up a target, if you will, give you what I think is the sequence, and other people may differ, but I think it's a reasonable place to start to pull all that literature together for clinicians and practitioners on that, given the conceptual issues and the practical issues that we've discussed so far. The development goes from simple to complex, as we've already talked about, and Sundberg pointed this out. Part of the problem with intraverbal behavior is that once the stimulus is presented, the stimulus is ultimately gone, whereas with visual stimuli, they're more likely to be present. They control the tact. It's also controlled a lot by complex conditional discriminations and involve influences by multiple stimuli and under multiple control, as we've talked about. This is pulled from Sundberg, 2016. It's a really nice paper. That special issue on the analysis of verbal behavior is very good. I'm going to go through these steps here. I'm starting off with I'm going to start here with number 1, which is simple discriminations. And this chart lays out simple, compound, and verbal conditional. 3 different areas that need to be addressed, and we'll address each one of them. I've got the star next to simple because now we're going to start with simple. It goes back to the 6 steps, okay? Early intraverbals, 1.5 years old, might include nursery rhymes, fill-ins. This may be a prerequisite for it. Nonverbal stimulus response reinforcer, most early skills such as tacting, listening, sewing, filling, animal sounds, word associations, and so on. Let me give you an example. I'll just play some videos of examples of these sorts of things. Simple kind of verbal discrimination with Max.
Max, what says meow? Yeah.
Whoops. Let me back it up. Okay.
Max, what says meow? Yeah.
Another satisfied customer at the Carbone Clinic in the background. I think you probably, you may have noticed that. But yeah, simple sort of discrimination. Let's take a look at another one of these. Simple discrimination. What says meow, cat, these fill-ins, these nursery rhymes. Another one with Max.
Clap your hands. Do this. Yes. What says nay nay? Good.
What says nay nay, clap your hands. Those sort of simple sort of fill-ins that are fairly simple discrimination. This is Matty, some of his early intraverbal behavior, playing some of his first vocal responses as well, under MO control as well.
Whoa! Here we go. Row, row, row your boat gently down the stream. Merrily, 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 life is but a dream, a dream.
Well, probably some man control for that word. Now, does he know what dream means? Certainly not. These are just speaker, 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 speaker. You speak, I speak. You speak, I speak. Early sort of intraverbal sort of response.
Good boy, Matty. Ring around the rosy, pocket full of cozy. Ashes, ashes, we all fall down.
Yeah, and there's the reinforcer. So it's multiply controlled. There's an MO controlling it as well as a verbal stimulus. The motivation is for being, dropped as he is here. So multiply controlled sort of fill in simple discriminations, easy to acquire, and it gets that whole speaker sort of repertoire beginning to develop. Teach early intraverbals. Early intraverbals may include intraverbals that are taught through prompting procedures and differential reinforcement. This may mean at first you may have to teach quite a few rote. And I suggest there's some people that are not sure this is the best way to go. There's some different thoughts on this, and I'll explain the different thoughts on as I move ahead. But I have found that it may be necessary to make use of what Sundberg described in his quick stimulus control procedures of doing echoic and tact intraverbal transfers. I mean, it's well established in the literature, this procedure. We'll look at it in just a second, and I'll look at how to select the targets and so on for this. But it's things like this. Something you drink from is and you basically present a cup as a nonverbal stimulus to evoke the response, and then something you drink from is and now the child says cup as an intraverbal. These are fairly rote, scripted sort of responses, but as Anna Peterstadter has made the point, and I think she's right, typically developing children's language acquisition in the natural environment results in many rote intraverbals early on. Rote intraverbals may be a natural step towards acquiring functional intraverbal repertoires. I think it may be necessary to do that. Some people suggest that it may take away from the ability to get multiple control of those responses and more generative, responses that have never been taught, but we'll talk more about that. These rote responses may make more complex intraverbal behavior more easily taught, I think. And this is a paper on prompting procedures. Let's take a look at some of these early intraverbals. I've given you diagrams here, just so that you can kind of, maybe not in the context of this presentation. I won't go through every one of these diagrams. You can just look at them, and maybe if you ever do, decide to review this information, you'll see but I'll show it to you in videos rather than talking you through every one of these diagrams. You'll see what's described in these diagrams. Here's some early intraverbals with Max, kind of tact to intraverbal sort of transfers. These are these early rote sort of ones.
Do the same. Good. Tap your head. Do this. What says nay nay? What says nay nay? Give me a high five. Do this. What says nay nay? Good.
So what says nay nay? And she presents a tact stimulus or a nonverbal stimulus horse. I don't know if a horse says nay nay, but that's what we use. I don't know. But what says nay horse, and then what says nay nay? Transfer trial, and then we get it independently. That's the kind of intraverbals I'm talking about. And we'll talk about how to select targets and put that together. But I think early on, Sundberg suggests that in most of his early writings on this topic. Sundberg and Partington book describes this sort of process. It's well described in the literature. I think you have to teach a lot of these. But there's a lot of other things you have to do to make these rote responses not just all you get. So we'll talk more about that. But I do think that this early sort of process is a necessary.
Boy. Here. Do this one next. Dora.
He's just asking for a reinforcer here.
This. Do this. Good.
There's another satisfied customer in the background, yeah.
Do the same.
That's just listener responding or imitation. Simple imitation.
What says meow? What says meow?
What says meow? Flash the picture of a cat. What says meow? Cat. Do a couple of distractor trials.
Right. Where is it? Nice job. What's that one?
Known tax. Now she's going to probe for the intraverbal response.
It's box. What says meow?
The reason why I suggest using nonverbal stimuli, although the literature is unclear as to what is the best way to go. Some kids do better with flashing, and some do better with echoic prompting. I generally use the nonverbal stimulus to produce it. mainly because a lot of the intraverbals come out of the tact repertoire. And it would be silly to teach somebody what says meow, and you prompt them echoically cat, and then you show them a picture of a cat and they don't know what it is. You get the idea that wouldn't make much sense to know what a cat says, but not know what a cat is, and not be able to identify a cat, not be able to tact a cat, not be able to act as a listener towards a cat. It just wouldn't make much sense. So I much prefer to ensure that the transfers occur with stimuli that are already in the repertoire of the individual under the control of a different operant, maybe, a listener response and a tact response. It makes sense to me that that would be the case.
Yeah. Dora. Dora.
We're just running some echoic trials to improve his articulation
Dora.
in the context of manding. That's what that is.
What's your name, Max?
Now there we use the echoic prompt. What's your name, Max? Because how else would you prompt? I mean, you show them a picture. You shouldn't say, when somebody shows you a picture, who's that? You don't say, I don't say Vincent. I say me. So we basically, there will be times when you use the echoic prompt.
What's your name? What does a duck say? Quack, quack. Do the same. What's your name?
And now we've faded out basically the prompt. It's a stimulus controlled transfer procedure, really. It's a time delay sort of procedure with a few distractors thrown in there, so as to make it more likely that the response is under the control now of the verbal stimulus. These are all responses that are not controlled by any problem solving. These responses are all sort of simple sort of responses. Examples of these sort of things. You cut with and you flash the object knife. What do you cut with? Knife. You cut with a knife, so on. What do you cut with? Knife after you fade. Those sorts of examples of that. This is just an example of the teaching procedure. You can read through it. I like to present the stimulus, prompt it, represent it with a time delay, or what's better called a prompt delay, then a couple of responses, and then present the stimulus as a probe and see if you get it. Okay? So let's take a look at target selection on this. What would this program look like? This might run for several months and maybe longer, this sort of program, because it's going to lead someplace else that you'll see in a minute. But it might be many months of teaching these sort of skills. Well, how do you select the targets and how do you kind of think about this sort of thing? This is not in your manual, but let me just pull this up for you. Teach many tacks. Okay? Teach hundreds and hundreds of tacks. And remember, by the time you're starting this, you've got 250, 300 tacks or so, or maybe more. So before you're starting this, one of the prerequisites is you have a very large tact and listener repertoire. Okay? Once you have, now you've got just hundreds of tacks. Now you take those tacks that are relevant and useful to the individual and develop several verbal stimuli to correlate with each tack. For example, the word shoes evokes wear, feet, tie, take off, put on. Okay? So there's lots of phrases related to that. Shoes are something you wear. Shoes you wear on your feet. Okay? When you put your shoes on, sometimes you have to tie them. Okay? Take off, put on, and so on. In other words, many stimuli associated with shoes, with carrier phrases, so to speak. And then you want to make sure that wear, feet, tie, take off, put on also evoke shoes. This is the difference between convergent and divergent stimulus control. Do this for many tacks. That's not spelled correctly. Yeah, it's not a tic-tac. Do this for many tacks. So you look at this whole range of tacks that you have, and now you would build phrases around them. And they sometimes referred to as bidirectional intraverbals. You go in one area, and you're basically developing divergent stimulus control. In other words, the word shoes evokes many responses. We'll talk more about that in a second. So shoes, many responses. And each one of those responses then becomes a stimulus that evokes the word shoes. That would be convergent stimulus control. So you develop divergent, convergent stimulus control. More on that in a minute. The point I'm making right here is take all of those hundreds of tacks you have and develop these sorts of arrangements in which you develop divergent and convergent stimulus control across many phrases. So a child just doesn't learn shoes are something you wear, or a cup is something you drink from. A cup is also found in a kitchen. You also put juice in it. There's all kinds of things about a cup. So you teach them many things about a cup. And many things will evoke the word cup. So you teach them many things about a cup, and the word cup will evoke many things, and many things will make you say cup. Cup will make you say a lot of stuff. A lot of stuff will make you say cup. You get the idea, back and forth. Cup, a lot of stuff, you say cup. Yeah, question.
So for that, would you use like almost like the teach test model, like Lawrence Holmes? That would you like teach them first like test to see if the reverse happens, or how do you do it here?
Yes, I would suggest doing that. The gentleman was asking, would you teach and see if the bidirectional, the reverse occurs? And many times it will. Sometimes it won't. There's mixed data on that in the literature, but yeah, exactly. See if the reversal occur. I'm going to actually show you a video where we do that. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it's bidirectional, and basically what you're doing is you're getting divergent stimulus control and convergent stimulus control kind of at the same time. Here's another important rule. So you've got that idea. This could be months and months of work to do this. You take every tact and you lay out all these. Months and months of work to get as many of these intraverbals as you can. But we'll see where we go next with it, okay? And what we do to break down the rote nature of that. For example, in order to fluently answer intraverbal questions, such as what grows on your head, what grows in a garden, what do you wear on your head, it's also valuable that a child can emit the words grow, head, wear, garden as tacts and respond to those verbal stimuli as a listener. In other words, when your carrier phrase is something you drink from is and the child says, now you flash a picture of a cup, make sure the child can tact drink and can, as a listener, respond to drinking. Make sure that the important words that are correlated, and to some degree, intraverbal behavior is like word associations. So make sure the words that should in fact control the response are also acquired as other operants, or there'd be kind of meaningless sort of responses. Make sure they're acquired, and Sundberg makes that point. For example, a magazine is something you read. Magazine should be mastered as a tact of a common object picture, and reading should also be mastered as a tact of an ongoing action or an action in a picture. Get the idea that the verbal stimuli, the components of the verbal stimulus must be acquired as other sort of other operants, listener responses, maybe mands, but also tacts, important component. So now you've got these hundreds of tacts, and you're going to develop these hundreds and hundreds of questions. You're going to have thousands and thousands, potentially, of this. And this could take several months to do. But there'll be things you'll be doing along the way to break down the rote responding. We'll talk about it in just a second. Example of this. This is an example of some intraverbal training using what I've just talked about right now.
Something that flies in the sky.
It's hard to hear. Tell me something that flies in the sky. There's an array of pictures there. And he says airplane.
Tell me something that flies in the sky. What is that? Well, touch your nose. Do that. Something that flies in the sky.
And he says airplane. Tell me something that flies in the sky. The airplane was there. Now, you could just flash the picture, or you could have an array of pictures, and you could point to the pictures. Tell me something that flies in the sky, and just point to the airplane. She was relying on his past history to evoke the response, despite the array. In other words, only the picture became an SD. All the other pictures became S delta for the response. But it was discriminative for the availability of reinforcement for responding if you responded to plane. Difficult sort of responding, kind of a conditional discrimination sort of approach to this. So that's one way of doing it. There's some other ways as well. Let me show you. Yeah, this is Britt and Jean Marie. This is from many years ago. But this is an example of what the gentleman was talking about. These are...
You sleep with that? Yeah. What do you want?
You sweep with a broom. What do you sweep with? She says broom.
Very good. Hey, broom, what do you want? You use a broom too? Mm-hmm.
And you use a broom to sweep, back and forth, bidirectional sort of intraverbal. Now, you may have to teach both of those. There's mixed evidence in the literature as to whether or not children with autism will acquire the bidirectional sort of... But here you're starting to build the convergent and the divergent classes. Yeah, you had a question? All those fill-ins come first. Oh, yes, that's right. That's what I would recommend. You do all those fill-ins first, and now when you're ready with hundreds of tacts, lots of listener responses, now you start to get into the what, who, why, where, those sorts of questions, with those sorts of carrier phrases, yes. Okay? So basically, spend a considerable amount of time developing this repertoire. And as I said, this could take many months of work to develop it. Okay? But develop as much as you can. But be doing with some other things in mind. There's a really nice paper in 2011 on multiple control of verbal behavior by with Jack Michael, Dave Palmer, and Mark Sundberg. I highly recommend you take a look at that paper because I think it's important for this topic. Here's some of the issues that are drawn from that paper. Perhaps the most complex aspect of establishing the verbal stimulus control necessary for intraverbal behavior is that multiple control is almost always involved. In other words, there's almost always multiple control. Skinner has an entire chapter on multiple causation in the first 11 chapters or so. Multiple causation. That no verbal operant is really under the control exclusively of the controlling variables that we sometimes describe. There's probably multiple control, and the idea that the intraverbal is under multiple control is fairly obvious. Remember stimulus 1, and then there's 4 other stimuli in the problem-solving example? There's multiple control always going on. Some people are even suggesting we should probably just even get away from identifying attack and define it that way, as a verbal response to a nonverbal stimulus. That is just too narrow a definition. That we should probably maybe not even use a lot of the nomenclature, so to speak, of the breakdown, and just talk about responses that are all multiply controlled. But that's a discussion for another day. Skinner describes 2 types of multiple control. The strength of a single response may be and is usually a function of more than one variable, and a single variable usually affects more than one stimulus. This is the idea that we've got to start now developing multiple control. Every time we're doing these bidirectional sort of intraverbals, we're getting at that, as you'll see here in just a second. This is a paper that was published recently, Analysis of Verbal Behavior, Intraverbal Training for Individuals, the Current Status of Multiple Control. It's a good paper to take a look at related to this topic. But now let's take a look at this multiple control we're talking about here. Okay? Teacher says round, says something round, something you throw, something orange, given the history of the child, something you kick, something you play with, and it results in ball. This is considered convergent stimulus control. This is the way you get away from the rote idea that you've taught one response to one thing and that's it. Now let's look at divergent stimulus control. Now when you say ball, you say something round, something you throw, something aren't, and so on. That's the idea of having taken all those tacks now and developed all these bidirectional sort of intraverbals back and forth, and now you're looking at classes of behavior. They used to be referred to previously as stimulus classes and response classes, but they're the same thing. It's basically convergent and divergent stimulus control. Let's look at examples of this. And then we'll talk about specifically how to teach it. Let's just look at some examples first of this. This is what needs to be happening in the context of teaching all those rote sort of responses. Take a look. Response and stimulus classes.
Tom, name some things you wear.
Shirt and pants and flip-flops.
Wear evokes many responses.
And a coat.
Good job, Tom. Tom, name some things that go.
Do name some vehicles.
Tom, name some
A
vehicles.
train.
Yeah, he's looking for
A
prompts.
rocket ship. An airplane.
And look at the latencies too, and look at what's going on in between. You know there's some kind of mediating sort of thing going on there. I mean, what's he doing? And you heard Maggie say he's looking around. If I were to say to you, name as many colors as you can. Well, at first you'd give the natural prism, okay? Roy G. Biv, right? You'd go red, orange, yellow, green, blue, and you go violet, and so on. But then I'd say, but name some hues too, some ones that don't occur in nature, okay? And you might be looking around and say, well, pink, chartreuse. Yeah. In other words, you'd start to look around and problem solve. You'd start to engage. The answer is an intraverbal, but there's a mediating response going on. You know something is going on there.
Truck. A motorboat.
Yeah, good job.
And you see that a motor is sort of like, you know that moment when it dawns on you there's another one? A motorboat. That's
Hey,
right.
turn around. Hold your hands. Tom, here's the crazy. Name some shapes.
Let me move ahead a little bit.
Foods.
Name some foods.
A macaroon.
A macaroon. When's the last time you ate a macaroon? Maybe never. And your life is fine without them.
Hey, macaroons are food. Good. Name some more foods.
Now watch the reverse.
Good job, Tom. Reinforcement. Okay. Now I'd like you.
Now we'll go with stimulus classes. Now we'll go.
Chicken, pig, dog, and bird are all
Animal.
Multiple control going into the convergent.
Yeah.
Profession, trampoline, Elmo, SpongeBob, and Kaplunk are all
Toys.
good job.
Kaplunk. I didn't know it was a toy, but in any case, you get the idea. You're going to try to, when you're doing all of these rote sort of intraverbals that I've talked about with that bidirectional stuff, you're going to try to develop these kind of classes as well. So lots of discriminative stimuli, verbal discriminative stimuli produce the same response, and the response then becomes a discriminative stimulus, and it produces many responses, divergent stimulus control. I think it's important to do this, or I don't think the intraverbal will develop as the way you want it to, and I think it'll get rid of some of the roteness. Now, here's what you're looking to do. We'll talk about how to get to this point, but here's what you're looking to get when you've done this. With all these rote, now you've got stimulus classes all developed, you're looking to get something that looks like this at the end of this step. And you're trying to put as many of these together as you can. This is what you're looking for. I'll just let it play, and then we'll talk about it.
Oh, Vincent, tell me something that goes.
Car.
Yeah, what else goes?
Bicycle.
Bicycle, what else goes?
Bus.
Yeah, and something else that goes?
Truck.
Uh-huh, something else that goes?
A captain.
Yeah, what else goes?
Airplane.
An airplane has
Wings.
wings. What else has wings?
Bird.
Bird, and a bird is an
But animal.
animal. Good, and what else is an animal?
Cow.
A cow is on a...
Ball.
Right, what else is on a farm?
Pig.
And a pig has a...
Tail.
What else has a tail?
Tiger.
Yeah, what else has a tail?
Zebra.
Uh-huh, what else has a tail?
A monkey.
What else has a tail?
Giraffe.
Yeah, what else has a tail?
Elephant.
Elephant lives at the...
Zoo.
What else lives at the zoo?
A tiger.
Yeah, and a tiger is an...
Animal.
Animal, yay!
TV.
Yeah!
Everybody got so excited, scared the heck out of them. Never did it again. But this is what you're looking to produce at the end of all these rows. Notice it has the feel. It's not a conversation, but it has flexibility. All those stimulus and response classes now are just bouncing back and forth. Well, that's what happens in a conversation. Okay? It's bouncing back and forth. And we've kind of now pulled together a theme. So it's not just like an interrogation. Okay? But it has a theme to it. And you tell me about an animal, and tell me about another animal. It has a tail. What else has a tail? Those two classes that you've built, those divergent and convergent stimulus classes, now come together in this kind of novel sort of way to produce somewhat novel sort of responding. Although they have been taught, but now they're occurring in a way that they've never been presented before. You have to pay attention, and as a theme, and that's what I call the webbing sort of procedure that I have not empirically verified. I've run it many times, and I find it does develop flexibility, and you start to get some novel responding from it. But I have no data other than clinical data to suggest that is the case, and we certainly need to do something with that. But I do think it produces something useful. So the purpose of all this rote stuff is to go to something like this, where there's flexibility and responding back and forth like a conversation. Yeah. Yes.
Can you speak a little bit about the age she's using that allows her to branch off so quickly?
Yes. Yes. You're asking how does she do that? I'll show you the materials that we use to set that up. Okay, I'll show you the materials we use to set that up. So this is still part of these rote responses, but this is what you're looking to eventually do with that, and by developing these classes. Okay, that's what and I'll describe that now. We talk about it. First, it includes teaching convergent and divergent stimulus control across all of these tacks that now have all of these other verbal stimuli that are correlated with them. And let's take a look at how this is more target selection. These are the reversals and so on. No, you can read this through, but it's more of what I've already said. This is just the teaching procedures. Now let's look at the teaching procedures in earnest. Here's one way of teaching. I have lots of slides with information that you can use because it's what I'm already going to say anyway. So I just skip through them because then you can go back to it and look. Here's some of the ways in which we develop this repertoire. with convergent and divergent stimulus classes. Watch. You just saw Tommy do that. Now I want to show you how we taught that. Okay? Here we go.
All right, buddy. Tell me something that you eat. Apple. Go.
Tell me something you eat. Apple. That was already acquired. Here we go with the second response.
All right, tell me something else you eat. Cookie.
Tell me something else you eat. Cookie.
That's right.
Now I'm going to show you this in a divergent stimulus. You would do the same thing convergently, okay? Except just the opposite direction. All of those answers then become stimuli.
Tell me something that you eat. Apple. Go ahead. Tell me something else you eat. Cookie.
So we prompted it again.
Right. Tell me something that you eat. Apple. Good. Tell me something else you eat. Cookies.
And then we set up a mastery criteria for when it's acquired. So now basically 2 responses in the class. Let's take a look at just a teaching of a third response. You get the idea. You just keep adding members of the divergent class.
Tell me something that you eat. Apple. Good. Tell me something else you eat. Cookie. Good. And tell me something else you eat. Banana. Very good, bud.
And you'll start to find that they will not necessarily respond in the same order any longer. They tend to mix up the order.
Tell me something that you eat. Apple. Good. Tell me something else you eat. Cookie. Good. Tell me something else you eat.
Prompted.
Banana. That's right.
Connor particularly likes this discussion of things you eat. He and I used to have a thing in our clinic in New York. He's now off doing lots of good things, but he was always on a calorie-reducing diet, and it just never was effective, unfortunately. But when he was ever on a diet, under deprivation, what do you like to do when you're deprived of food? You like to talk about food, So he'd walk into the clinic each day, he'd yell, Carbone, and then I'd come out and talk to him, and we'd just yell foods back and forth. Hamburger, French fries, chicken nugget, we just yell foods back and forth. That was our conversation, and he'd say, oh, okay, and he'd sit down and we'd be done. But that was our interaction. We'd yell foods at each other. Oh, gosh.
Tell me something that you eat. Apple. Tell me something else you eat. Tell me something else. Banana.
You get the idea. Quick story about Connor. He was just received confirmation as a Catholic, but at St. Patrick's Cathedral in Manhattan, with the Cardinal Dolan doing the. I thought he was surely going to choke him or something. There was going to be. Who would know what would happen? But he did fine. Now, one of the things you can do during this is now do some lag schedules, sort of looking for novel responses. So watch what happens here.
Tell me something that you eat. Apple. Good. Tell me something else you eat. Cookie. Good. Tell me something else. Banana.
Those were all taught.
Good. Tell me something else you eat. Chips.
Notice it was a weaker response, but it was a novel one. That's what you're looking to do during this process, is to see if you can get a bunch of novel responses to occur as well.
Very good. What else do you eat? Pretzels. Very nice, Con.
Yeah, and now weaker responses signifying the strength of the response. It whispered it kind of. But that's the idea of now looking at getting some novel responses to what's referred to as lag schedules. In other words, anytime you add a new member to the class, untaught, that gets a dose of reinforcement, and you then get reinforced more highly, differentially, for the novel ones. Yes. Yes, they would. Yeah, you don't see it here, but yes, that's right. It would be very important to do. Yes. And I won't show you the 5th and 6th, but you get the idea. In terms of error correcting, what we basically do is when he makes an error, fails to respond, we just represent the stimulus and prompt. So no reason to go back through that. You get the idea on that. It's simply that. Now, what we try to do in all these rote responses, all of these stimulus classes we've developed, remember, the end goal of that is to get this flexibility in terms of the web sort of thing that you saw with Vincent, back and forth, an animal, tell me another animal, they live at the zoo, what else lives at the zoo, who has a tail, what else has a tail, and so on. So I have some data sheets here. You can look at these sheets, but let me just show you where it all goes. It goes into a form that looks like this. The lady was asking, how do you kind of organize this sort of thing? It looks something like this. We start to develop, we look at all the intraverbals that this guy has responded to in all these classes, and we put in the middle one of the known tacks, and then we web it all together. You notice when you say animal, you say dog, you say cat, you say fish, you say horse, but also you notice the arrow goes back the other way. When you say horse, you say animal, you say fish, you say animal, cat, you say animal, dog. Now, with dog, you also have pet, legs, tail, and it goes back and forth on that one, and you actually put together this web. So each one of the tacks are in the middle there, and it's all branched out. And now you take that and write the script that was then used that Emily was going through with Vincent to get all that to occur. So it's all these rote ones. It's try to get away from it with some lag schedules and with divergent classes and convergent classes, and then pull it together in terms of these webs and see if you can get flexibility in the responding from moment to moment. That's how we set up that script. So that script came right off of this. But this takes some time to look at all your data sheets, all the ones that have been acquired, and now put them within a theme. And you just branch them out into these webs and develop as many of these as you possibly can to get rid of a lot of that rote sort of responding. Let's take a look. I just have a few more here for you to see. Let's look at some more examples of this. This was tell me an animal, a dog, and how about another animal, a bird, and one more animal, a cat, and a cat has a tail, right, and something else that has a tail and a cat is an animal, and so tell me another animal. How about another animal? And a bird flies in the sky. What else flies in the sky? All of these have been taught, but now they're all part of a flexible sort of way of responding. We think it breaks down some of the roteness. We think we start to get some novel responding. Once again, I don't have any, I have clinical data, but I don't have any peer-reviewed data to suggest, but I do think it's an important step. Take a look at another example of this.
Vincent, an airplane is a
toy.
Okay, an airplane is a
Vehicle.
Right, and what else is a vehicle?
Car.
What else is a vehicle?
Bus.
A bus. A bus is a color?
Yellow.
What else is yellow?
Banana.
A banana is something you
Eat.
Right, what else is something you eat?
Apple.
Yeah, another thing you eat.
Hamburger.
Hamburger, good.
TV. Cookie.
Mm-hmm.
A couple of mans in there too. Well, you
Tell me something.
you kind of get the idea. I won't play any more of them. You kind of get the idea of where those are going. Teach many rote interverbal responses. Develop these convergent, divergent classes before attempting to develop a more complex intraverbal repertoire, and use this kind of webbing sort of process in which you get this flexibility to develop. I think these are prerequisites. I don't think you would start any of this until you've got a 2.5-year-old language level. So all of this would require a 2.5-year-old language level, lots and lots of tags. Up until that time, all the fill-ins and those sorts of things. Now looking at what has been shown to be effective in overcoming some rote responding and teaching conditional discriminations. Once again, there's a progression from simple to complex. And this is just an example of, I'll just give you a quick example of conditional discrimination from one of Judah. Judah allowed me to use this. You have the sample, which is a green circle, just giving you the idea of conditional discriminations. And here it's a visual, and when you touch the other green one or put it with it, you now get reinforced. Okay, so the green stimulus becomes discriminative for the availability of reinforcement for responding to it under the condition that the sample is a green green circle. The comparison to the red circle becomes an S delta. It's negatively correlated with the availability of reinforcement for selecting under these conditions. So a simple conditional, once again with the word shoe, selecting there, that's an auditory visual. I say the word shoe and you touch the shoe. Once again, an auditory visual. Simple discrimination. The dog is an S delta. In the presence of shoe, touching the dog is not correlated with the availability of reinforcement. Only the shoe is correlated with the availability of reinforcement in the presence of the shoe. Simple conditional discrimination. Well, that's what's going on with a lot of the advanced intraverbal, is this verbal conditional discrimination. Let's take a look at an example of that. When I say what color, verbal conditional discrimination, and you're looking at the green apple, what color changes the wavelength of light reflected by it into a stimulus positively correlated with the availability of reinforcement for saying green. So the word color alters some aspect of the stimulus so that the only response that's scheduled for reinforcement is green. What do you get a lot of times when you present that? You say, what color? And what do you get? You get apple. Exactly right. In other words, is a breakdown in the verbal conditional discrimination. There's a breakdown in that conditional discrimination. Remember we said that's some of the problems that we see. What do you smell with? Poopies. There's this breakdown, and we'll see more examples of this in a second. I'll show you some examples from our clinic on that sort of thing. So now we have to overcome this sort of problem. And this is just Jack Michael's comments on that, as well as Mark's things I've already just said. This is a quote from Francesca Di Espinosa on this issue. The auditory verbal stimulus color strengthens a variety of interverbal responses related to colors, and the nonverbal stimulus strengthens the tact. The response green is under the control of both antecedent conditions, under the control of the verbal stimulus as well as the nonverbal stimulus, and in particular the wavelength of light reflected, which is what colors are, so green. Okay? So that's a difficult sort of discrimination to make. Some people have said that if you directly teach some of that rote stuff, that you may have difficulty in ultimately getting that. So there's a little bit of controversy on that. I think until there's other data to suggest otherwise that I would teach those rote runs with all the caveats I gave you regarding divergent, convergent, and maybe some of the webbing stuff to break it down. But some people say that maybe that will not be the best way to do it. Let's take a look at some examples of this and where the problems are in this. Now we're talking about these verbal conditional discrimination that we've got to teach. Tell me some red fruits. When you say tell me some red fruits, a number of responses should be evoked verbally by that, okay? So tell me some red fruits, okay? Well, there'll be a bunch of fruits and a list of some foods, but only those that are both a fruit and red, like maybe apple, will in fact be reinforced, okay? That's that whole idea of a verbal conditional discrimination. Tell me some red fruits. And this is compounding, okay? Not only are we talking about fruits, we're talking about red fruits. And any one of those stimuli, red or fruit, if it controls the response, will not produce a response scheduled for reinforcement in the presence of red fruit. That's the difficulty. Let's look at some examples of this. Vehicles that fly in the sky. If you get a simple discrimination, what do you get with the word vehicle? You get car. Vehicles flies in sky. The word flies controls the response. You get bird. Vehicle flies in the sky. Sky, you get cloud. Vehicle flies in the sky. The combination of all three stimuli produce airplane. That's the complexity that needs to occur. And that's the complexity in responding that needs to occur. Let's take a look at some errors. Some typical sort of errors in this situation.
Awesome. Can you tell me something that's not a food?
A pizza.
That is a food. Can you tell me something that's not a food?
A tomato.
Not a food, tomato?
It's not a food.
A peach.
A peach.
Those are all foods. Can you tell me something different that's not a food? A drawer, that's right.
Yeah, I probably looked around a little bit and was evoked by multiple control. Examples of errors. Let's look at a few more of these. The kind of errors that we're talking about here. And some of them really are amusing as well, because they...
Hey, that's right, good job. And when do you wear sandals?
Let me back it up. Verbal conditional discrimination, the type of errors that occur.
Can you tell me when you shower?
You wash your hands.
Tell me when you shower.
When you shower, wash your hands.
You take a bath.
Take a bath.
Okay,
shower and take a bath are intraverbally linked, no control by the time in which you do it.
And when you brush your teeth?
The toothbrush.
Toothbrush. Get the idea. Brush teeth. Toothbrush. Toothbrushing is correlated with brushing teeth. These are the kinds of errors that you frequently see. And here's just some other examples. Name a vehicle that goes on water, you get car. These are just some additional examples of that. sometimes they're amusing as well, some of these errors. Listen to this one.
Hold your hand. Hands up nice and loud. Okay, Narayan, can you tell me a time when you're brave?
3 o'clock.
3 o'clock. Okay.
3 o'clock. A time when you're brave. 3 o'clock, he says with great authority. That's what I mean. They're kind of they're amusing. When all the stimuli don't control the response, you get these out of context sort of responses that are somewhat amusing. These are some examples, some additional examples of this. Let's talk about how to maybe overcome some of these difficulties. I usually start in the context of the tact relation. I start in the context of tact, and other people have suggested the same sort of thing, okay? This is just a diagram of it, but let's take a look at the kind of errors that occur, okay? Show you a quick example of this. So to try to correct the verbal conditional discrimination, start in the context of tacting. Watch. But this is an example of errors.
Yellow. What color is this block? Yellow. What size is this block? Yellow. What size is this block? Pink.
What color is this block? Yellow is fine. What size is this block? And there's other blocks relative to it. It is a big block. And what happens is you're still controlled by what color it is. Here's what can happen. You say, what color, what color, what color, what color, and kids do fine. What size, they may make a mistake, and then you say big or little, and big or little, and they do fine. What size, what size, what size, fine. You mix them all together, and that's where it breaks down in many cases. It's sort of like, what is this? And many kids will say, silver pen. And people will reinforce that, think, well, he said 2 words, perfect. That's not what anybody would say when I held this up. They're covering all their bases, so to speak, okay? It's a pen, it's silver. One of those is going to be right. Let me try both of them, okay? The response to this is pen, not silver pen. So you get these breakdowns in these kind of conditional discriminations. Let me show you some ways that people have used to overcome these sorts of errors. Let me show you an example of this. This is the same item, different question. Here's what we do. This is a guy that has basically tacks of these size and shapes and colors and all kinds of stuff. This is Connor. And here's what we do first. We line up some objects, and we run it in the tact room.
All right, Connor, hold your hands. Good, buddy. What is it? What color? What color? What is it?
Same object, we have size and color and name. Color and name, you could do size as well. Okay, color and name to the same object. It's a little bit easier to do.
What color? What is it? What is it? What color? What color? What is it? What is it? What color? What is it? What color?
You get the idea. We run them through. If he makes an error, what we do is represent the stimulus until he gets it right. It's been our error correction procedure. It's worked reasonably well to get good responding, like you see there. We run another phase where we go different item, different question. Different item, different question. Now we're going across.
What color? What is it? What is it? What color? What is it?
So we ask one, what is it? Then we go to something else. What color? What is it? What color? What color? What is it? What is it? What color?
Nice job, Connor. Here's your movie.
And now he does reasonably well there in order to try to basically get him to come under the control of the stimulus that's relevant, that is discriminative for the availability of reinforcement for some response. And then finally, we present novel examples to him, and these are just some data-taking procedures. I'll show you just some examples of this with 3 objects, with three different dimensions. Here's with three different dimensions.
One of our favorites.
Yeah, watch what he does here.
All right, back.
Size, color, name.
Are you ready? Here we go. What is it? What size? What color? What size? Look over here. What size? Yellow. What size? What size?
And we keep presenting until we get the correct response.
What color?
Yellow.
What is it? Counter. What is it? What color?
Yellow.
What size?
Blue.
What size?
Red.
What color?
Yellow.
What color?
Blue.
What is it?
Fish.
What is it?
Fish.
What size? What is it? What color?
Fish.
What color?
West.
What size? You got it, Con.
Yeah, example of that. A way to overcome some of these conditions, I'll show you other ways as well as we go a little further, but one of the ways to do it is to do it in the context of tacting and use multiple sort of stimuli across many of them. We found that to be fairly effective in overcoming some of those conditional discriminations, okay? There was a paper presented here a few years ago by Francesca D'Espinosa. She's doing another paper here as well, 2014. I suggested, this is the link for it, that you take a look at it. She has another way of looking at this. She has a joint control way of doing this. I won't spend a lot of time on it except to get to this one page where I can explain it. You can read all the rest, but let me get to this one page that describes it. What is it? And what she teaches a child to do is whenever I say what is it, you say it's a, basically an autoclitic frame. It's a. Well, you almost never say it's a green. But when you say it's a, you always name an object. So she gets, whenever somebody says what is it, she intraverbally links it to it's a. The child will always say that automatically. And then as a result of that, the prevailing name of the name of the object now has greater strength and more likely to say, what color? The child says color, and then Nate says green. What animal? It's a. Less likely to say brown. What does it say? It says. In other words, she intraverbally links some autoclitic frames that tend to make it less likely you'll produce that. So in the case of Connor, it would be, what color? He would say color. What is it? He'd say it's a. And make it less likely that you would produce that. And she has some nice data. She hasn't published the data yet. It was part of her dissertation. But she has some nice data to suggest that this may be a useful sort of thing to do to overcome. So in other words, to do what we just showed you with the other procedure, but to take a look at these sort of things. What I recommend you do is you take a look at her paper and her 3-hour workshop on this, where she describes this in some detail. I think it makes good sense. And I think it can be valuable. It's usually done with children with a little bit more advanced skills than, for example, Connor might have. But nevertheless, I think it can be a useful way to overcome some of those conditional discrimination problems. And here are some of her descriptions of it. Takeaway point: to develop sophisticated intraverbal behavior, the learner must come under the control of an increasingly greater number and more complex configuration of words presented in the antecedent stimulus. The combination of these words produce a response unique to them. Hot foods you only eat in the morning, for example. That sort of thing. I think some ways to overcome it is what I've just described to you. And take a look at what Francesca has described. I think you'll find it useful. Let's take a look now at some teaching methods for increasing conditional discriminations. There have been a number of ways to go about trying to overcome these problems with these conditional discriminations. And I think you're doing two things now at this point. After you've done all the rest, I think what you're doing is you're trying to have problem-solving responding now start to occur. And basically at this point, I stop teaching in any way, and all I do is probe. I've taught all of this, and now I basically probe to see what kind of control is being exerted by the verbal stimulus, okay? But there are some teaching procedures that you may embed in the context of this, but now you're trying to see what kind of problem solving you're getting, and if you're not, there are some procedures for teaching problem solving. But I generally start to just kind of probe it. You'll see what I mean here as I present more and more increasingly complex stimuli. But there are some teaching procedures that seem to work as you begin to do this. This is an older paper by Streifel in 1978, but here are some things you can do. Let's take a look at them. Emphasize the verbal stimulus. Here's an example of it when trying to teach these. Emphasize key words.
Awesome. And tell me something that is not a food.
Now, it was ineffective in this particular case, but you get the idea. Tell me something that's not a food. In other words, try to emphasize, and there have been a few studies that have suggested it may be effective.
Watermelon. That's a food. Tell me something that's not a food.
Exactly.
Can you tell me something that's not a food?
A table.
That's right.
You get the idea. Try to emphasize the word may be a thing to do when you're starting to introduce these complex. Here's double word. Double word presentation.
Ryan, when do you go to bed?
You go to sleep.
Listen, when do you go to bed?
When do you go to bed?
12 o'clock.
Now you at least got a time, okay? You at least got a time in that particular case. So I'm going to show you a bunch of introducing more complex stuff. These may be some teaching procedures that may be useful. There was a couple of papers by April Kaisermore on basically teaching a DOR, a differential observing response. That comes right out of the experimental non-human animal literature on basically observing responses, which are frequently used in complex schedule sort of arrangements. And delayed conditional discrimination stuff, a whole bunch of stuff, memory sort of stuff as they call it. But take a look at an example of this. Getting the child to do something like this.
Okay, look up here. Tell me an animal that has wings.
I know.
An animal that has wings. In other words, literally teach a child. You say, tell me an animal that has wings. You teach the child to say, an animal that has wings. Kind of a differential observing sort of response. They respond to the stimulus, okay? They make an animal he did that on his own, but you would literally teach that to the individual. Kaisermore in 2 papers showed that it made a difference in multiply controlled intraverbal responses.
Eagle.
An eagle. You have to know something. Look at that latency. That can't be just, you know when you do something like this, somebody asks you a question, you go, oh, my vacation. You know exactly there's something covert happening there. And there's no question that there is. And it's probably some of the things that Palmer described and I've described already to you in terms of visualizing, in terms of talking to yourself, in terms of asking questions and so on.
Here we go.
It's an example of that notion of using repeating the stimulus. Let me go through with you now from the literature what has been suggested as ways to overcome. I've showed you some ways to overcome the verbal conditional discrimination in the tact relation. We've talked about some possible teaching procedures, as I just described, emphasizing prolongation and the idea of repeating. Let me now show you some things that seem to be useful in overcoming some of these. This is a procedure, and you'll find it in Judah Ack's paper in 2008. Take a look at what this looks like now.
You've already got 700 points, and I'm going to work to get you another.
This is Ryan in our clinic in Dubai. And that's Shun working with him from Ireland, but working in the Dubai clinic.
They're different. Yeah, exactly. You're so smart. Okay, you ready? Ready, steady, go. Show me the red ball. Show me the yellow block. Show me.
Notice there's also an orange block. In other words, there's other stimuli that are similar, but he's got to respond to both parts of the stimulus in order to. This is the idea of kind of training it in the listener. There's been some evidence that if you train it in the listener repertoire, you may get some benefit from it in the intraverbal repertoire, especially if the individual is tacting either covertly or overtly.
The green card. Show me the big cup.
Notice there's a little cup too.
Show me the big marker. Show me the small piece of paper. Good boy, Ryan.
Yeah. It's an example of responding to, so in the listener repertoire, basically responding to multiple stimuli. Another example here.
All right, good boy, Ryan. Give me the utensil you eat soup with.
Utensil you eat with. You eat soup with,
Give me
right?
the tool you use to cut paper.
And there's other things there.
Okay. Give me the utensil you use to cut food.
So eat soup with, cut food with, different, but nevertheless, they're similar. But now discriminations. In other words, all the stimuli have to control the response for you to choose the correct one. Any one of the stimuli do, you'll be making mistakes.
Good boy. Give me the vehicle that flies in the sky.
And there's other vehicles.
Thank you. Very nice. Give me the one you eat in the morning.
There's other food items there.
Huh? Why eat in the morning? That's something you eat in the morning. All right, close your hands. Give me the one that's not found in the bathroom. Not found in the bathroom.
And I gave her the toothbrush. There's an error. It's the idea of not being controlled by all the stimuli. That's where you might do. That's not found in the bathroom. Let's take a look at some other things, some other ones. Listener by feature, function, in class. There's been a nice paper that looked at this issue of emergent intraverbal forms may result as a result of listener training for children. A paper published in 2016 in that special issue. This may overcome some of those difficulties. Listener responding by feature, function, in class. This seems to make a difference if the individual tacks the item at the same time. Okay? This may help to overcome some of these things. Quick example. Listener responding and tack to intraverbal.
Yeah. Very good. Which one do you drink with?
Which one do you drink with?
Which one? Glasses, that's right.
Now, she's actually tacting, but she looked at it as identifying. She could touch it, but you get the idea. But this comes to a quick end. Her mother decides to wait a second. Don't you just get a brain freeze from watching that? You can just feel it, can't you? Way to go, Britt. You get the idea there. Let's look at Josh. It's another guy in a home program from a few years ago. Let's take a look at what he does. Listener responding, feature function, tack to intraverbal.
Makes you big and strong. Which one has strong legs? Greta. Which one is in the sky? A moon. Good job.
Great articulation.
Yeah.
Great. Much.
Which one is in the sky?
White stitches. Which one has white stitches? Good. Which one is a community helper?
Yeah, and now as he touches it, he says policeman, he tacks it, and so on. Example of listener by feature, function, in class. This paper here basically showed if tacking occurred at the same time, you'd get some real benefit from that. Let's take a look at another student in our clinic in Dubai with Alia, teaching this particular individual.
Which one do you watch movies on?
Which one do you watch movies on?
Okay, and what's this one? It's an underwear, and can you show me which one you sit on?
Which one you sit on?
And what's this one here? It's a tiger. You're right. What color is this? And which one do you play music on?
And you get better responding if you get the tact at the same time. Let's take a look at another example of this, where this is Saud. Whoops. Let me show you. This is Saud working with Noor in our clinic in Dubai. What example of this idea of LRFFC with tax?
Show me the one you use to make a phone call. What do you use to make a phone call?
Make a phone call?
Show me the one you use to wash your hands. Show me the one you use to wash your hands. So, look.
basically prompting him to tact it.
Show me the one you eat.
Corn, now he's tacting it.
Sorry, baby, show me the one you wear. Show me the one you wear. Sure.
Yeah, and with the tact. You tend to get more better intraverbals and intraverbals that you've never taught through this process. A nice paper published on this topic. Another example of this that Judah Axe points out. This is kind of a matrix sort of training with Ryan, with action and object. As listener responding.
And here's a new one that we haven't done before. Okay, I want you to push the scissors.
Push the scissors.
Okay, now point to the spoon.
Point to the spoon.
Okay, a little bit. Now touch the banana. Okay, and tap the car. Okay. So now I want you to push the banana. Okay, and touch the spoon. Okay, tap the...
It seems that some listener training with multiple components in the stimulus seems to be helpful in developing the intraverbal response, and Judah has a nice description of that as well. Here's some from Anna Peterstad, a paper on this. Here's an example of mixed or matrix intraverbals. Matrix intraverbals. Same sort of idea with Ryan.
Okay, Ryan, can you tell me something that you eat that's red? An apple. An apple, you're right. Okay, what about something that you play with that's yellow?
See him looking around? That's the problem-solving repertoire. That's the overt problem-solving repertoire, which is similar to the covert one that many of us engage in. Asking ourselves questions.
Okay. What about something green that you see in the clinic? Chair. Okay. What about something white that you drink? Milk. Okay. What about something yellow that you drink? Lemonade. Lemonade. What about something yellow that you eat? A banana. A banana. Okay, I'm going to give you so many times to be such a good boy. How about something green that you eat?
Something green that you eat. There's that problem solving. There's something going on there.
Something green that you eat.
Now she presents it again. Something green. Notice he kind of prompts himself a little bit.
Grape.
Grape.
Right. What about something red that you play with? Toy car. Okay. What about something yellow that you see in the clinic? Do you know something yellow that you see in the clinic? Okay. What about something red that you drink? So something yellow I see in the clinic.
He's still back on the other one.
What's something red that you drink? Cherry juice. Cherry juice. Very interesting. Okay. What's something green that you drink?
Something green that you drink. Doesn't sound like you should be drinking it. But listen what he says.
You think it's something green that you drink?
He then says, you know that cucumber stuff my mother makes that's supposed to be healthy?
What's the punch in the cucumber?
Oh yeah. It's like a lemon and lime and cucumber drink, right? What's it called?
What's it called? You get the idea. He's thinking about which one he needs to drink. Tacting by feature, function, and class is another way of looking at this. Not only that, but the effects of tact and listener training on the emergence of bidirectional intraverbal relations basically showed some advantage to this. Tacting by feature, function, and class.
Can you tell me what's this one? Chicken nuggets and a horse desk?
Tell me which one do you sleep on? Bed.
Sleep on bed?
Bed. What's this one?
Intraverbal?
Okay, what am I doing? Knocking. And which one do you sleep on? Bed. Look. Okay, let's get all your...
Points to the same place where the bed was. Seeing in the absence of the thing seen, I think, is what's going on there. I think she's basically uses that as a prompt.
Can you tell me what's this one here? It's a helicopter. And what's this? It's a foot to your right. And what do you paint with? You do paint with a paintbrush.
This is
Can you tell
Alia.
me which one do you eat? Ah, okay.
That's the idea of tacting. She also touches it, but all she had to do was tact it. And there seem to be some advantages to doing that. Okay. Intraverbal responding by multiple dimensions. Let me give you some other examples of this sort of thing. Multiple dimensions. Now, these are all the studies that have looked at, I'm trying to give you as many of them as I can on verbal conditional discriminations. I don't know who it's best for and what order you present these. I'm basically at this point saying, here's what everybody says you ought to do, and I found to be somewhat effective, and I make use of, in terms of overcoming these verbal conditional discrimination. I'm throwing the kitchen sink at it right now. It has not, this protocol has not been refined in any way where which child, which prerequisites will do best with what. I'm basically throwing at you all the literature and all of them. When you're ready to teach verbal conditional discriminations, it seems like LRFFC may help. Some listener responding may help. Some tacting by feature function in class may help. And the idea is now you start to present multiple dimensions in the verbal stimulus and let the individual respond. And you may want to use prolongation, emphasis, differential observing response to have those occur more effectively and more likely to occur. So this is that whole section on, this is what people are talking about more in the literature on how to go about doing some of these things. And I think I've presented that to you. Yeah, this is another example of something that may be effective.
You want to stop? What do you mean by that?
Okay, and what you forward. Okay, put your hands, all right? What do you write on? Paper. And what do you eat on? Plate. Okay, I'm gonna give you 2 tokens, right? Well done. All right, what do you eat that's red? An apple. All right, what do you play with that's red? Blocks. Yeah, good idea. Okay, so 2 more. All right, here we go. What do you eat that's round? Cake. Fold your hands around. Okay, what do you throw that's round? A ball. All right, fold your hands. Okay, 2 more tokens for you, doing such a good job. Listen up. What's a brown animal? A bear. Okay, and what's a green animal?
Bear.
A frog. And what's a brown food? Chocolate. And what's a green food? Peas. Peas. Okay, and what's a red food? Apple. An apple. And what's a red drink? Okay, and what's a yellow drink? Lemonade. Lemonade. Red drink is like wine.
He's a lot of fun, as you can tell. It appears that an extensive tact repertoire may also be important in developing conditional discriminations. I think that is the case. There's a nice paper here by Anna Peterstatter and some other individuals, Devine and so on. Emergence of intraverbal responding following tact instruction with component stimuli. I think a large tact repertoire was probably beneficial as well in developing the intraverbal. Let me give you examples of this. Let me back it up. In other words, mother says, describe this. It's not just what is it, but describe this. And you're asking for multiple components. Extensive tact repertoire.
What about this? Loki. This. Loki.
Good. What about this? Very good.
It's a red tomato.
Good. What about this? What is this? Look at it. Freeman, what is this?
Yellow.
What is it?
Let me show you.
Bear running.
Here's an example of
What do you see? White bear running.
what do you see? I see white bear running. In other words, the tact is controlled by multiple dimensions of the stimulus. Okay, there are multiple dimensions there. It's a white bear and it's running. So tell me everything you see. I see a white bear running on the table might be included as well. That type of tacting, developing an extensive tact repertoire may have some benefit in developing the more advanced intraverbal response. There's some evidence to suggest that may be the case. The use of lag schedules, we already talked about that possibility. And here's some stuff by Inga Varson on basically block trials where you present the stimulus continuously until you reach a certain criterion. In this particular case, you're looking at teaching responses to similar verbal stimuli. What do you sweep? What do you sweep with? What do you eat? What do you eat with? This seems to help in developing some of the conditional discrimination. Take a look.
What do you eat? What do I eat? A burger. What do you eat with? Fork. Okay, what do you sweep? A broom. What
There's
do you
the arrow.
sweep with? My hand. Okay. I sweep the floor. I sweep with the broom. All right, what do you
And he corrected it, you notice there. He was thinking about it.
throw? A ball. What do you throw with? My hand. What do you kick? A ball. What do you kick with? My foot. Okay, and what do you touch? The dog. What do you touch with? My hand. That's better. Nice.
Example of some block trials and a procedure to develop conditional discriminations that was published a couple of years ago. There are various methods to teach verbal conditional discriminations. All or some combination of them can be used until novel responses hopefully are being evoked and you're coming under the control of the multiple stimuli. I suggest making use of these. Let me end up now with a discussion on problem solving and some literature that exists on problem solving. Remember, the conditional discrimination issues verbal conditional discrimination along with problem solving, probably a part of the solution to this this difficulty with many kids with autism. Typically, children with autism are taught to respond to a series of WH questions. These may develop includes hundreds of responses. However, it may not be the way typically developing kids learn the repertoire. Problem solving may be an important part of that. We've talked about some of this issue already with Dave Palmer's discussion in 2016, his 1991 paper on that similar sort of issue. There have been a couple of papers that have been published in JABA on the role of problem solving in complex intraverbal repertoires. One of them by Rachel Sauter et al., where she describes a procedure for basically using some rules about when you look at the stimuli that are presented, that you engage in some form of verbal behavior as a kind of mediating sort of response. And so she sets up some rules. The rules were to remind people to, name kitchen appliances, okay? When you name kitchen appliances, they're correlated with basically that phrase. Name kitchen appliances and you name them. So she's got this situation in which she's asking somebody to talk about things that they have seen after they have been presented. Okay, so it's intraverbal behavior. Tell me about the kitchen appliances, where were they, and so on. And she gives children a bunch of rules in order to do that, in order to remember, so to speak. In other words, using covert verbal mediation to remember things. And she considers it a problem solving, and there's a nice paper on that. Another paper published that accompanied that fairly soon after was a paper on visual imagery by Abel Kaisermore et al. And what she basically did is she taught typical children to tact items and its category, vehicles, kitchen items, and so on, then asked them to name the items in the categories and the subcategories. And what she did was taught them, these are typical preschool children, taught them to remember by doing what? She would basically show them an image on a screen, and she would basically look at it on a display like this, and she would say, okay, I'm going to close my eyes, and I'm going to remember everything that I saw in that. I'm going to remember the categories and everything that I saw in that. I'm just going to remember all of that. And then she would fade out slowly but surely, basically teaching them to see in the absence of the thing seen through a fading procedure. And then she did the same thing with the kids. She trained them to basically look at things, and then she started to fade it out, and for the children to basically mediate through visual imagery, seeing in the absence of things. And then when asked these questions, she'd say, now use your visual imaging, remember what you saw, close your eyes, think about what you saw, see if you can see it, all those kinds of things. And what she found was some kids did reasonably well with that. In both cases, if you didn't give the rules, here are the rules of what you should do, the verbal mediation and the visual imagery, you didn't get any responding. The kids had to be told to use their rules, and they didn't use them across situations. You had to constantly do it. But there's some evidence to suggest that verbal mediation as a problem-solving technique and visual imagery as a problem-solving technique may in fact be pretty useful sort of thing. What we've tried to do, and I've done for a number of years, is try to do something similar to this. Let me show you a video example of this. And I'll talk about this procedure in the context of the video example. Questions with the video on. What we do is we take a video a child might like, and we basically show the video and we ask some questions. Now, we teach the children to tact what they're seeing as well and to think about what they're seeing. But we can't give the kind of rules that you could give to the preschool children because they're not under that kind of verbal control. So we tell them to tact some things and try to remember what you see. So first we ask some questions with the videos on, which are basically multiply controlled tact and intraverbal responses.
Jock is going somewhere. He doesn't want anybody to see him.
This is Lady and the Tramp. This is Alyssa and Jerry.
What does Jock have in his hole? You're very good.
So the response is controlled by what she asked and what she sees.
Who was looking for Jacques? Yeah, very nice. She found him.
And he's recording yes or no, correct or incorrect.
Oh, I think something's about to happen.
I wouldn't be annoyed. A fully new color.
What did Lady get us a present?
We stopped giving formal prompts and telling her, and we let her explore and problem solve what the answer is by presenting the stimulus.
What's that around Lady's neck?
Leash.
Yeah. Yeah, right here. That leash, it goes around the neck.
Right.
Yeah, let's listen to that part again. Put your hands on the table. Put your hands on the table. Listen to that part again. What did Lady get us a present?
A very new color.
Yeah! What is Trusty doing when Lady comes to visit him?
Sleeping.
Yeah, that's super, you know.
Multiply controlled.
Oh, it's June, dear.
Who whistles for Lady?
June, dear.
Yeah, very nice.
Please excuse me.
Oh man, he's stretching. He just got up from a good night's sleep. Oh, he's thirsty.
Listen to what Jerry asks here.
How did Tramp drive?
Jerry's from the South, Alyssa is from New Jersey. This caused a problem. How did Trump dry off? Look at Alyssa. She's not sure. But in any case, what we then do is basically turn off the video and ask questions again. Okay? And then what we do is ask novel questions. We're basically trying to see whether or not this will evoke some sort of problem-solving vision. It's not quite as easy. This procedure and this sort of procedures with problem-solving kind of beg for some investigation by behavior analysts that go take the Kaisermore work and the SOTA work and basically do it with kids with autism to see what you can produce in terms of problem-solving. But something like this, I think, is going to be useful. Show the video, ask a bunch of intraverbal sort of questions, now turn it off, see what response you get, and then see what you get in terms of novel. And what can you teach the child to do while watching it that will make it more likely that some sort of problem solving and some sort of mediation is likely to occur. I think those are some of the things I think are important in teaching the intraverbal. What I've tried to do is pull together as much of the literature as I can, probably miss some along the way, and I'm not sure of the exact order, but nevertheless try to pull together what's known and kind of throw the kitchen sink at this problem, and only through more years of research and refinement of this topic will we know exactly, and maybe not exactly, but we'll have a better idea of what that protocol ought to look like. But I think we've kind of uncovered a few things. The researchers in this field have uncovered a few things that suggest some ways to go to develop this repertoire. Very good. Hope it's helpful to you. Thank you very much for coming, and best of luck with the children you work with. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carbone. I don't know if I can speak for all of you, but all the research and the presentation, it just covered so much in such a small amount of time, but I don't know if you feel the same way I do, but I got a ton out of it. Code, it's PUP, or PUP, 867. PUP 867.